Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Marcus Bloodworth, and I've been a park ranger for 25 years. I've seen every kind of trouble these North Carolina mountains can throw at a man. Flash floods that turn peaceful streams into death traps. Forest fires that move faster than a running horse. Black bears that forget their fear of humans when they're protecting cubs. After a quarter century in the Nantahala National Forest, I thought I'd handled it all. I was wrong. October 12th, 1966, started like any other Wednesday. The morning air was crisp, smelling of dying leaves and that clean scent you only get in the mountains after a good rain. I was making my regular rounds through the Joyce Kilmer section, checking campgrounds and making sure the tourists weren't doing anything stupid. Fall brings out the city folks who think camping means bringing half their house into the woods. At 49, I wasn't the young ranger who could hike 20 miles without breaking a sweat anymore. My knees creaked when I climbed out of the truck, and my back reminded me of every tree I'd climbed and every injured hiker I'd carried out on my shoulders. But I knew these woods better than my own backyard. Every trail, every creek crossing, every rocky outcrop where someone might slip and break an ankle. My wife Sarah always said I loved these mountains more than I loved her. She was joking mostly. But after 27 years of marriage and 3 kids, she understood that the forest was part of who I was. When I retired next spring, I'd miss the daily patrols more than the paycheck. The radio crackled on my belt as I locked up the truck near Poplar Cove. Unit 7, this is base. You copy? Unit 7 here, Jenny. What's up? Jenny Martinez had worked dispatch for 3 years. She was good at her job, kept calm when things got crazy. But today her voice sounded tight. Got a report about some missing campers at Site 12. Family called in this morning, said their relatives never came home. How long overdue? Supposed to check out yesterday morning, left all their gear behind. I sighed and started walking toward the campground. Missing campers usually meant one of 2 things. They'd gotten lost on what they thought was an easy trail, or they'd decided to extend their stay without telling anyone. The gear left behind was odd, though. Most people packed up everything, even if they were just moving to a different site. I'll check it out. What's the family's name? Henderson, from Charlotte. 2 adults, 3 kids, ages 8, 12, and 15. 5 people don't just vanish. Not from a developed campground with marked trails and pit toilets every quarter mile. But as I walked through the maple and oak trees, their leaves painted gold and red by the October sun, I felt something I hadn't experienced in all my years in the forest. The woods were too quiet. No squirrels chattering, no birds calling. Even the insects seemed to be holding their breath. The only sound was my boots crunching through the fallen leaves and the distant whisper of wind in the treetops. I'd learned to trust my instincts out here. When something felt wrong, it usually was. Animals know things before we do. They can sense storms coming hours before the Weather Service issues warnings. They run from forest fires before the first wisp of smoke reaches human noses. Today, it felt like every living thing in the forest was hiding. Site 12 sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering tulip trees. The Henderson family's tent was still pitched, stakes driven deep, rain fly properly secured. A blue Coleman cooler sat beside a cold fire ring. Folding chairs were arranged in a neat circle. Everything looked normal, like the family had just stepped away for a bathroom break. But they hadn't. I called. Out. Following protocol. Hello! Park Service! Anyone here? My voice echoed off the trees and died. No answer. No movement except a few leaves drifting down in the still air. I walked around the campsite, looking for signs of where they'd gone. The Hendersons had been neat campers, no trash scattered around, no damage to the vegetation. But there were no footprints leading away from the site either. The ground was soft from recent rain. 5 people walking anywhere should have left clear tracks. They hadn't. Inside the tent, sleeping bags were laid out but not slept in. Clothes were folded in neat piles. A flashlight sat beside a paperback novel, bookmark marking someone's place on page 43. Personal items that people don't leave behind. Wedding rings on the small camp table, a child's stuffed animal, prescription glasses in a hard case. I'd worked enough missing person cases to know the signs. When people leave voluntarily, they take their important stuff. When they're taken against their will, everything gets left behind in a hurry. When they run from danger, belongings get scattered. This was none of those things. This looked like 5 people had simply stopped existing in the middle of their camping trip. I radioed Jenny. Unit 7 to base. I'm at Site 12. Found the Henderson camp, all gear intact, but no sign of the family. Any tracks? That's the strange part. No tracks leading away from the site. It's like they just disappeared. Want me to call the sheriff? I looked around the empty campsite one more time. In 25 years, I'd never seen anything like this. But I'd learned not to jump to conclusions. There was always a logical explanation, even when it wasn't obvious. Give me another hour to search the immediate area. Maybe they went exploring and got turned around. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The Hendersons had vanished without a trace, and something in these quiet woods was very, very wrong. I spent the next 2 hours searching every trail within a mile of Site 12. Called out the family name "you" until my throat was raw. Checked every creek bed where someone might have slipped and fallen. Looked behind every boulder big enough to hide a person. Nothing. It was past noon when I decided to head back to the truck and call for backup. That's when I saw movement in the trees ahead. A flash of bright blue through the brown and gold leaves. "Hello?" I shouted. "Henderson family?" I jogged toward the movement, boots sliding on wet leaves. Maybe one of them had gotten separated from the group. Kids sometimes wandered off, got curious about something, and didn't realize how far they'd walked. But when I pushed through a stand of young maples, what I found made my blood freeze. A man in a blue jacket stood about 30 yards away, perfectly still, facing away from me. Something was wrong with the way he stood, too rigid, like he was made of wood instead of flesh and bone. "Sir, are you okay?" He didn't turn around, didn't move at all. I walked closer, hand moving instinctively to the radio on my belt. 20 feet away, I could see that his jacket was torn. Dark stains covered the bright blue fabric. "Sir, I'm a park ranger. Are you injured?" When I got close enough to see around him, my legs nearly gave out. The front of the man was gone. Not cut away or torn off. Gone. Like something had reached inside him and scooped out everything from his chest to his knees. But he was still standing, still perfectly balanced, like his body hadn't figured out it was supposed to fall down. I stumbled backward, fighting the urge to vomit. In 25 years, I'd seen bear attacks, hunting accidents, heart attacks, and drownings. But nothing like this. Nothing that defied every law of nature I understood. "Base, this is Unit 7. I need immediate backup at my location. And call the coroner." Jenny's voice crackled back, professional calm even though she could hear the shake in my voice. "What's your situation, Marcus?" I stared at the impossible sight in front of me. How do you explain something that can't exist? "I found one of the missing campers. He's dead, Jenny, but he's still standing up." "Say again?" "Send everyone. Send the sheriff, the state police, whoever you can get. Something's very wrong out here." While I waited for backup, I forced myself to examine the scene. The man, I assumed it was Mr. Henderson based on the age and build, stood in a small clearing between 2 oak trees. No blood on the ground, no signs of a struggle, no tracks except mine. It was like he'd been walking through the forest and something had reached out of thin air and hollowed him out like a pumpkin. But that was impossible. I walked in a wide circle around the body, looking for any clue that might make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I noticed the shimmer. About 10 feet to Henderson's left, the air looked different, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt in summer, but there was no heat source. The shimmer was roughly the size of a doorway, maybe 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide. I stepped closer, and the hair on my arms stood up. The air around the shimmer felt charged, like right before a lightning strike, and there was a smell, metallic and wrong, like blood mixed with ozone. As I watched, the shimmer grew stronger. The distortion spread outward like ripples on water. Through the wavering air, I caught glimpses of something else, another forest, but wrong. The trees were the same species but arranged differently. The light was too red, and in the distance, shapes moved that didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen. Then I heard the screaming. It came from the other side of the shimmer, high and desperate. Human voices, more than one, crying out in terror and pain. The sound cut through the air like broken glass. I reached for my radio, but before I could key the mic, something pushed through the distorted air. An arm, human, reaching through from the other side like it was pushing through invisible water. The fingers clawed at the air, trying to grab something, anything. I lunged forward without thinking, caught the hand in both of mine and pulled. For a second, I felt the weight of a person on the other side, someone fighting to get through. Then something else grabbed them, something strong. The hand was ripped out of my grip so hard it nearly dislocated my shoulders. The screaming stopped. The shimmer began to fade, and within seconds, the air looked normal again. Just forest, just trees and leaves and afternoon sunlight. But Mr. Henderson was still standing there, still impossibly dead and upright. And now I knew where his family had gone. Sheriff Dave Morton arrived first, followed by 2 state police cars and an ambulance that wouldn't be needed for anything more than body transport. Dave had been sheriff for 15 years, and we'd worked together on dozens of cases. He was a good cop, methodical and calm, but I could see the confusion in his eyes as he stared at Henderson's body. "Marcus, what the hell am I looking at?" "I wish I knew." The state police photographer took pictures from every angle while the medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Wells, examined the body. She was a small woman with gray hair and 30 years of experience with violent death. I'd never seen her look shaken until today. "Dave, I need to speak with you privately," she said after 20 minutes of examination. They walked away from the scene, but I could hear fragments of their conversation. Words like impossible and never seen anything like it and no medical explanation. While they talked, I led one of the state police officers to where the shimmer had appeared. "Right here," I said, pointing to the empty air between the oak trees. There was some kind of distortion, like heat waves, and I heard screaming from the other side. Officer Mike Castellanos was young, maybe 25, fresh out of the ACAD. EMI. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "The other side of what?" "I know how it sounds, but something came through here. Something took the rest of the Henderson family." "Came through from where?" "I don't know. Somewhere else? Somewhere wrong." Dave walked back over, his face grim. "Patricia says Henderson died from massive tissue loss, but there's no trauma to explain it. No cuts, no bullet wounds, no animal bites. His organs and muscles are just gone, like they evaporated." "That's impossible," Castellanos said. "Yeah, well, impossible seems to be the theme today," Dave replied. "Marcus, I need you to walk me through everything you saw from the beginning." I told them about finding the empty campsite, tracking the movement through the trees, discovering Henderson's body. When I got to the part about the shimmer and the reaching hand, Dave held up a finger to stop me. "You're saying you saw some kind of doorway in the air?" "I know how it sounds." "And you heard screaming from the other side?" "Multiple voices, in terrible pain." Dave looked at Dr. Wells, who shrugged. "Dave, I've been a medical examiner for 3 decades. Henderson's body violates every law of biology I know. If Marcus says he saw something impossible, maybe we should listen." That's when Officer Castellanos' radio crackled. All units, we have a possible mass casualty incident at Bear Creek Campground. Multiple missing persons, evidence of violence." Bear Creek was 8 miles south. I knew it well, a popular spot for fishing groups and scout troops. Dave and I looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. "Dave, I need to see that scene." "You're not a cop, Marcus. But I know these woods better than anyone, and if this is connected to what happened here..." He nodded grimly. Let's go. The drive to Bear Creek took 15 minutes on winding mountain roads. I used the time to think about what I'd witnessed. The shimmer had looked like a doorway, but a doorway to where? And what kind of creature could hollow out a human being and leave them standing upright? Bear Creek Campground was chaos when we arrived. 3 more police cars, 2 ambulances, and a crowd of park visitors being interviewed by officers. I spotted Jenny Martinez coordinating with the emergency responders. She must have driven up from headquarters. "What's the situation?" Dave asked the lead investigator. 8 missing persons from a fishing group out of Asheville found their campsite about an hour ago. No bodies this time, but plenty of blood. He led us to Site 7, where a group of men had been camping for 3 days. Their gear was scattered like a tornado had hit. Overturned coolers, collapsed tents, folding chairs thrown in all directions. But it was the blood that made my stomach turn. It was everywhere. Splashed across the trees, pooled in the dirt, sprayed across the remains of their tents. Enough blood for 8 men, but no bodies. "Any witnesses?" Dave asked. Family camping 2 sites over heard screaming around dawn. Lasted about 10 minutes, then stopped completely. They thought it was kids playing around until they saw all the blood. I walked the perimeter of the site looking for the same signs I'd seen at the Henderson scene. The blood spatter patterns were wrong, too random, too widespread. It looked like the 8 men had been attacked by something invisible that struck from all directions at once. And there, near the shattered remains of a camp table, I found it. Another shimmer in the air, fading but still visible if you knew what to look for. This one was larger than the first, maybe 10 feet wide. As I watched, it flickered like a TV with bad reception, giving me brief glimpses of what lay beyond. Red sky, twisted trees, and in the distance, structures that might have been buildings but looked organic, like they'd grown instead of being built. "Dave," I called. "Over here." He jogged over, followed by 2 other officers. "What is it?" "The doorway. It's still partially open." They looked where I was pointing, and I could see the skepticism on their faces. The shimmer was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for jar. "I don't see anything," one of the officers said, but Dave was staring intently. His eyes narrowed. "Wait, there is something, like the air's moving wrong." As we watched, the distortion grew stronger. The red light from the other side began bleeding through, casting strange shadows on the trees around us. And then we heard the sounds. Not screaming this time, something worse, wet, tearing noises, like something large feeding on something soft. "Jesus Christ," Dave whispered. That's when we saw the eye. It appeared in the center of the shimmer, huge and yellow, with a pupil like a vertical slit. The eye was easily 3 feet across, belonging to something much larger than any creature on Earth. It looked at us with alien intelligence, studying us like a farmer might study livestock. The eye blinked once, slow and deliberate. Then the shimmer collapsed, leaving only normal forest air. But the damage was done. We'd seen into their world, and they'd seen into ours. The hunting was just beginning. By evening, 3 more campsites had been hit. 19 people vanished without a trace, leaving behind scenes that made no sense to anyone except me. Each site had blood evidence, but no bodies. Each site had a fading shimmer where reality grew thin. I sat in the ranger station with Dave, Dr. Wells, and Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI's Unexplained Phenomena Unit. Apparently, the government had people who dealt with impossible things. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I kept holding the mug anyway, needing something solid and real to anchor myself. 36 people in 1 day, Agent Chen said, reading from her notes. No witnesses to the actual incidents, no physical evidence except blood spatter and these alleged dimensional distortions that only Ranger Bloodworth can see clearly. "I'm not making this up," I said for the 10th time. "I believe you," she replied. "The blood evidence alone suggests something unprecedented. But I need to understand what we're dealing with." Dr. Wells leaned forward. "Sarah, I've examined tissue samples from all the sites. Whatever's taking these people is extracting organic matter with surgical precision. No tool marks, no trace evidence, just clean removal of flesh and organs." "Removal for what purpose?" I set down my coffee mug and looked around the room. These were smart people, professionals who'd seen their share of strange cases. But they were trying to apply normal logic to something that existed outside normal reality. "They're farming us," I said quietly. Everyone stopped talking and looked at me. "Think about it. They're not killing randomly. They're harvesting, taking people but leaving the campsites mostly intact. They want the locations to remain attractive to new visitors." Agent Chen frowned. "Farming implies organization, intelligence." "Yeah, and they've been doing this for a while. I've been thinking about all the missing person reports from the past few years. Hikers who disappeared without a trace, hunters who never came home. We always assumed they got lost or fell off cliffs or ran into bears." "How many?" Dave asked. I pulled out a folder I'd put together while waiting for the FBI. "In the past 5 years, 63 people have gone missing in the Nantahala National Forest. 63 people whose bodies were never found." The room went quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of police radios. "That's just our forest," I continued. "I called rangers in the Pisgah, Cherokee, and Great Smoky Mountains. They've all had unusual numbers of missing persons cases, people vanishing near remote campsites and trailheads." Agent Chen was taking notes furiously. "You're suggesting some kind of coordinated harvesting operation across multiple national forests. I'm suggesting these things have been picking us off slowly for years, but something's changed. They're getting bolder, taking larger groups in broad daylight." That's when Jenny's voice crackled over the radio. All units, we have reports of screaming from Fontana Village. Multiple witnesses." Fontana Village wasn't wilderness. It was a resort community with cabins, a lodge, and a small restaurant. If the entities were attacking there, it meant they'd moved beyond isolated forest sites. "How many people at the village?" Agent Chen asked. "This time of year? Maybe 40 guests plus staff," I said. "We need to evacuate everyone immediately." Dave was already heading for the door. "Marcus, I need you with me. You're the only one who can see these doorway things clearly." The drive to Fontana Village took 30 minutes on dark mountain roads. By the time we arrived, the screaming had stopped, and that silence was more terrifying than any sound. The village looked normal from the outside, warm light glowing in cabin windows, cars parked in neat rows. But as we got closer, I could see that the light in the windows wasn't moving. No shadows passing in front of lamps, no flicker of televisions. The main lodge was completely silent when we entered. The lobby looked like everyone had vanished in the middle of normal activities. A chess game sat half-finished on a corner table. A book lay open on a reading chair. The registration desk had a half-eaten sandwich sitting next to a cup of coffee that was still warm. "Hello?" Dave called out. "Police, is anyone here?" No answer. Just the quiet hum of the heating system and the tick of an old clock on the mantel. We searched the ground floor systematically. The restaurant had dirty dishes still sitting on tables, meals half-eaten. The kitchen showed signs of interrupted dinner preparation, vegetables chopped and waiting to be cooked, a pot of soup simmering on the stove. 43 people, Dave said, reading from the guest register. 43 people don't just disappear. But they had, and I knew where they'd gone. I found the shimmer in the center of the lodge's main dining room. This one was massive, 15 feet wide, 10 feet tall, stable enough that I could see clearly into the other dimension. The other Earth looked similar to ours, but wrong in every detail. The trees grew in perfect geometric patterns. The grass was too uniform, too green. And scattered across the landscape were structures that looked like barns, but barns designed for harvesting people instead of grain. Through the transparent walls of the nearest structure, I could see them. Human figures moving slowly, mindlessly. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They were alive but changed, their movements mechanical and purposeless. And watching over them were the entities themselves. They were large, maybe 12 feet tall, with multiple arms that ended in precise cutting implements. Their heads were bulbous and yellow-eyed, like the eye we'd seen earlier, but attached to bodies that moved with disturbing efficiency. They managed their human herds with the same casual competence that farmers showed with cattle. "Dave," I whispered, "you need to see this." He walked over and looked where I was pointing. His face went pale as the reality of what we were facing sank in. "Those are people in there," he said quietly. "The missing hikers. The vanished families. They're not dead, Dave. They're being farmed." One of the entities turned toward the shimmer, as if it could sense us watching. Its yellow eyes focused on us with predatory intelligence, and it began walking toward the dimensional barrier. "We need to get out of here," Dave said. But I was thinking about something else. In 25 years as a ranger, I'd dealt with every kind of natural disaster. I'd learned that sometimes the only way to save lives was to make hard choices, to sacrifice something valuable to prevent something worse. The entities. East were expanding their operation, becoming bolder, taking more people. If we didn't stop them now, the harvesting would spread beyond the mountains to cities, towns, millions of people. Thought about the emergency demolition charges I kept in my truck for clearing rock slides from roads. High-powered explosives designed to move tons of stone, maybe enough to destabilize the geological formations that seem to anchor these dimensional doorways. "Dave, I need you to call in an evacuation order for the entire national forest. Get everyone out, campers, staff, everyone. What are you thinking?" The entity was almost at the barrier now, its cutting arms extended, ready to push through into our world. "I'm thinking it's time to close the door." The evacuation took 6 hours. Every ranger, every police officer, every National Guard unit in western North Carolina worked to clear the forests of people. We told them it was a gas leak from a military accident. Not entirely a lie, considering what I was about to do. By dawn, I was alone in the Joyce-Kilmer section with 50 pounds of demolition charges and a lifetime of knowledge about these mountains' geological structure. The shimmers were appearing everywhere now, dozens of them, as the entities prepared for a large-scale harvest. I'd called Sarah that morning, told her I loved her, told her I was proud of our kids, told her not to worry if I didn't make it home. She'd cried and asked me what I meant, but I couldn't explain. How do you tell someone that you're about to blow up half a mountain to save humanity from interdimensional farmers? The charges had to be placed precisely. The entity's doorways seemed to anchor at points where the rock formations created natural stress patterns, places where the Earth's crust was already under pressure. If I could destabilize those anchor points simultaneously, the geological upheaval might seal the rifts permanently. I worked through the morning, placing explosives at calculated points along the ridgeline. The shimmers were getting stronger, more stable. Through them, I could see the entities mobilizing for what looked like a full invasion. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, gathering at the barriers between worlds. By noon, I had the charges set. A single remote detonator would trigger them all, bringing down 3 square miles of mountainside in a controlled avalanche that would reshape the entire valley. I was hiking back to the detonation point when I heard the screaming again. But this time, it was coming from our side. A family had ignored the evacuation order. Parents and 2 small children who'd been camping in a remote site and never got the message. They were running through the trees, terror on their faces, something invisible pursuing them. I could see the shimmer moving through the forest like a predatory wave, carrying entities from the other dimension. The family had maybe 2 minutes before they were caught. I keyed the detonator and looked at the red button that would end this. If I waited for the family to reach safety, the entities would have time to establish more stable doorways. They might be able to maintain their invasion even after the geological disruption. But if I triggered the charges now, the family would be caught in the avalanche. 25 years as a ranger had taught me that sometimes there are no good choices. Sometimes you have to choose between bad and worse. I thought about the human farms I'd seen through the dimensional barriers. The thousands of people already trapped in that nightmarish reality. The millions more who would follow if these creatures succeeded in their invasion. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the running family. I pressed the button. The sound was like the earth screaming. 50 simultaneous explosions ripped through the mountainside, sending tons of stone tumbling into the valleys. The ground bucked under my feet like a living thing, and I was thrown flat as the avalanche roared. It passed me. The shimmers winked out one by one as their anchor points were destroyed. Through the last few, I could see the entities on the other side, their yellow eyes filled with what might have been rage or disappointment. Then the barriers collapsed completely, severing the connection between dimensions. The silence that followed was total. No wind, no birds, no insects. Just the settling sounds of displaced stone and the ringing in my ears from the explosions. I found the family 3 hours later, buried but alive in a pocket formed by 2 fallen trees. The children were unconscious but breathing. The parents had broken bones but would survive. They were airlifted to a hospital in Asheville and told they'd been caught in a natural landslide. The official report blamed the geological instability on decades of underground mining operations and recent heavy rains. The missing persons cases were attributed to the same landslide, unfortunate victims who'd been camping in the wrong place at the wrong time. Agent Chen and I met once more 6 months later at a coffee shop in Charlotte. She looked tired, older than her years. "The disappearances have stopped," she said without preamble. "Good." Completely stopped. Not just in North Carolina, but across the entire Appalachian region. 67-year pattern of missing persons cases ended overnight. Patterns end. She leaned forward. "Marcus, we both know what really happened up there. The question is whether it's truly over." I thought about that morning in the forest, watching the dimensional barriers collapse. But I also thought about the entities I'd seen, their advanced technology, their organized society. Earth was just one world among many, and creatures that sophisticated probably had more than one way to travel between dimensions. "For now," I said. "But Agent Chen, you might want to keep monitoring those missing person statistics. And if they start rising again in any mountain range anywhere in the world, you think they might try again? I think we taste good to them. And farmers are persistent." I retired 3 months early and moved with Sarah to Florida, far from any mountains where the Earth's crust might grow thin. But I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, listening for sounds that don't belong, watching for shimmers in the air that might mean the barriers are weakening again. Because somewhere out there, in a dimension where humans are livestock and Earth is just another ranch, the entities are probably planning their next harvest, and next time, they'll be ready for us. My name is Solomon Grimm, but folks just call me Saul. I've been a ranger in Jefferson National Forest for 18 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these Virginia mountains could throw at me. Bears, wildcats, poachers, lost hikers, you name it, I've dealt with it. Before this job, I spent 12 years in the Marines as a sniper. 2 tours overseas taught me that a good shot can solve most problems, and anything that bleeds can be stopped with the right bullet. I live alone in a cabin near Mount Rogers, about 20 miles from the nearest town. It's October 1972, and the leaves are turning that perfect Virginia gold that brings all the city folks up here with their cameras. Most days, I like the quiet. Just me, my rifle, and the forest that's been my home longer than anywhere else. The radio crackled to life at 6:15 a.m. on what started as an ordinary Tuesday. "Saul, you there? We got a situation up at Pine Ridge Camp." That was Martha, our dispatcher. Her voice sounded different, shaky in a way I'd never heard before. I grabbed the radio from my kitchen table. "Go ahead, Martha. Sheriff wants you up there right away. Says to bring your rifle and... Soul, he says to bring body bags. Lots of them." "How many we talking about?" The silence stretched so long I thought the radio had died. Then Martha's voice came back, barely a whisper. 17, Saul. All of them." Pine Ridge was a hunting camp about 10 miles north of my place. Popular spot for groups coming up from Richmond and Norfolk. Rich guys mostly, doctors and lawyers who wanted to play mountain man for a weekend. I'd been up there before to help track wounded deer or settle disputes about hunting licenses. I loaded my truck with everything Martha mentioned, plus some extra supplies. Medical kit, camera for evidence, rope, flashlight. In 18 years of ranger work, I'd found 3 dead bodies total. 2 heart attacks and 1 hunting accident. 17 was, well, that was something else entirely. The drive up to Pine Ridge took me along Timber Ridge Road, a winding dirt path that follows Whitetop Creek. Usually it's peaceful, just the sound of water running over rocks and wind moving through the pines. But that morning, something felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. No bird songs, no squirrel chatter. Even the creek seemed muffled. About halfway there, I noticed something odd. Fresh tire tracks in the mud, but not from any vehicle I recognized. The treads were wrong, too wide, too deep, like something incredibly heavy had pressed them into the earth. And they didn't follow the road. They cut straight through the forest, going from tree to tree in a perfectly straight line. I stopped the truck and got out to look closer. The tracks were definitely fresh, made sometime after last night's rain. But what kind of machine could drive straight through dense forest without getting stuck or damaged? And why would anyone do that? Getting back in the truck, I noticed my hands were shaking a little. Not from cold, it was a warm October morning. Something about those tracks, about the silence in the forest, was getting under my skin. In Vietnam, we learned to trust that feeling. When something feels wrong, it usually is. The rest of the drive passed without incident, but the wrongness kept growing. No animals anywhere, no insects buzzing. Even the wind had stopped. It was like the whole mountain was holding its breath. I could smell Pine Ridge Camp before I could see it. Sweet, thick smell that reminded me of the field hospitals overseas. When I finally rounded the last bend and the camp came into view, I had to stop the truck and sit there for a minute, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Sheriff Williams was standing next to 3 other men I didn't recognize. Government types by their look. Dark suits, despite the mountain location, serious faces, expensive shoes already muddy from the forest floor. One of them had a camera with a telephoto, lens bigger than my rifle scope. "Saul!" Sheriff Williams waved me over. He was a good man, someone I'd worked with many times over the years. But his face was pale as November frost, and his hands wouldn't stop moving, adjusting his hat, checking his radio, fidgeting with his badge. "What we got here, Sheriff?" He gestured toward the main cabin. "See for yourself. But Saul, I gotta warn you. I've been doing this job for 26 years, and I ain't never seen nothing like this." The main cabin at Pine Ridge Camp was a sturdy log structure with a wide front porch and 3 smaller bunk cabins arranged around it in a horseshoe pattern. From the outside, everything looked normal. Trucks parked in neat rows, camping gear still laid out to dry from the previous day's rain, coffee pots still sitting on the porch table. But when I got closer, I could see what had Sheriff Williams so shaken up. The screaming. Not current screaming. These sounds were older, soaked into the wood itself. You know how sometimes you can walk into a house and feel that something bad happened there? This was like that, but 100 times stronger. The very air around those cabins felt thick with terror. "They're all inside," Sheriff Williams said, his voice barely steady. "We haven't moved anything, waiting for you and these federal boys to document everything first." One of the government men stepped forward. He was tall and thin with gray hair cut military short. "Agent Morrison, FBI. We got a call about unusual circumstances surrounding multiple deaths. What's your assessment of the situation, Ranger Grimm?" I looked at Morrison, then at the sheriff. "Haven't been inside yet. What exactly are we dealing with?" Sheriff Williams swallowed hard. "Saul, you know I'm not a man who scares easy. Been to war, seen car accidents, house fires, all sorts of terrible things. But this," he shook his head, "Deus, this ain't natural." We walked toward the main cabin together. As we got closer, I noticed more strange details. The front door was standing wide open, but there were no signs of forced entry. No broken wood, no scratches on the door frame. Whatever happened here, the victims had either let it in willingly or it didn't need doors. "When did you find them?" I asked. "This morning around 5. Camp owner comes up every Tuesday to check on things during hunting season. He called us from the payphone down at Miller's store, said he couldn't get close enough to see what was wrong, but he knew something was bad." Agent Morrison was taking pictures of everything. The undisturbed camp chairs, the cold fire pit, the hunting rifles still leaning against the porch rail. No signs of struggle outside the cabins, he noted. Whatever happened, it happened fast. I stepped onto the porch and immediately felt the wrongness intensify. The wood creaked under my boots, but the sound was different. Heavier somehow, like the boards themselves were weighted down with dread. "Sheriff, how many men were supposed to be here?" 17. Same group comes up every October for the past 5 years. Doctors and lawyers from Richmond. Dr. Patterson organized it. He's been coming to these mountains since he was a boy. The smell was stronger on the porch. Not just that hospital smell I'd noticed earlier, but something else underneath it. Something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. I pushed open the screen door and stepped inside. The main room was set up for a large group, long wooden tables arranged in a U-shape, camping chairs scattered around, playing cards still laying on one table next to empty beer bottles. A fire had burned down to cold ashes in the stone fireplace. Everything looked normal until I looked closer at the chairs. Each chair had dark stains on the sea, at and back. Not blood. The color was wrong for that. These stains were darker, almost black, and they had a greasy quality that made my stomach turn. "They're in the back room, Sheriff," Williams said quietly. "All of them." Agent Morrison was documenting everything with his camera, but I could see his hands were shaking slightly. Even federal agents aren't prepared for everything. We moved through the main room toward a door marked storage. Sheriff Williams reached for the handle, then stopped. "Sol, I need to tell you something before you see this. What's in there? It ain't right. It ain't natural. And once you see it, you can't unsee it." I nodded. In Vietnam, I'd seen plenty of things that weren't right or natural. Dead men walking through rice fields, shadows moving wrong in the jungle, sounds that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Sometimes, the world shows you things that don't fit into normal thinking. "Let's get this done," I said. Sheriff Williams opened the door. The smell hit me first, that sweet, thick hospital smell mixed with something else. Something alive. The storage room had been cleared out to make space, and 17 men were arranged in a rough circle on the wooden floor. But they weren't dead. They weren't alive either. Each man was... I still don't have good words for it. They were conscious, their eyes tracking our movement, their mouths trying to form words. But they had no bones. None at all. They were just masses of flesh and organs, somehow held together, somehow still breathing, somehow still aware of what had happened to them. Dr. Patterson, I recognized him from previous years, was trying to speak. His mouth moved soundlessly, and tears ran down what should have been his cheeks, but was just soft flesh folded in on itself. Agent Morrison dropped his camera. The sound of it hitting the wooden floor seemed impossibly loud in the terrible silence. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. But Sheriff Williams was already backing toward the door. "Saul, we need to get out of here. Now." That's when we heard it. A sound from outside the cabin, deep and rhythmic, like footsteps, but not quite right. Too heavy, too spaced out, and there was a clicking noise with each step. Click, thud, click, thud, click, thud. Whatever was making that sound was coming toward the cabin. The footsteps stopped right outside the cabin door. We all froze, even the government men who probably had training for situations like this. Though I doubted anyone had training for what we were dealing with. Click, thud, click, thud. Now the sounds were coming from the porch. Whatever was out there was walking back and forth, like it was checking the place out. Or maybe like it was deciding whether to come inside. Agent Morrison bent down and picked up his camera with shaking hands. "We need to document this," he whispered. "Whatever's happening here, people need to know." I pulled my rifle off my shoulder and chambered around. The familiar weight of the weapon felt good in my hands. In all my years of hunting and military service, I'd never met a problem that couldn't be solved with the right bullet placed in the right spot. The walking sounds moved around the cabin, going from the front porch to the side, then toward the back. Sheriff Williams had his service pistol out, and I could see the other federal agents reaching inside their suit jackets. "How long have those men been like that?" I asked quietly, nodding toward the storage room. "Don't know," Sheriff Williams replied, "but the camp owner said he could hear screaming up here yesterday afternoon. Said it went on for hours." Hours. Those 17 men had been conscious and aware while something removed every bone from their bodies, and they were still aware now, still trapped in their boneless flesh. The walking sounds stopped. For maybe 30 seconds, everything was completely quiet. Even the men in the storage room seemed to be holding whatever passed for breath in their current condition. Then something knocked on the front door. 3 deliberate knocks, almost polite. We all looked at each other. Agent Morrison had his camera ready. Sheriff Williams had his gun pointed at the door. I was trying to figure out angles and sight lines, where to position myself for the best shot. The knocking came again. 3 knocks, same rhythm, same polite tone. "Should we answer it?" one of the other federal agents whispered. "Hell no," I replied. "Nothing that leaves 17 men in that condition deserves politeness." But the decision was made for us. The door opened. I expected to see some kind of monster, some creature from nightmares or old stories. Instead, a man walked in. He was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, wearing a park ranger uniform that looked exactly like mine. He had a normal face, brown hair, regulation boots, except for his eyes. His eyes were completely black, like looking into deep water at night. "Afternoon, gentlemen," he said in a perfectly normal voice. "I understand you found something unusual here." Agent Morrison raised his camera, but the thing that looked like a ranger held up one hand. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The camera fell apart in Morrison's hands. Not broken. It just came apart, piece by piece, like someone was taking it apart with invisible tools. Screws, springs, lens pieces, all of it falling to the floor in a neat pile. "Now then," the ranger thing said, "I believe you've been examining my work. What do you think?" Sheriff Williams found his voice first. "What are you? What did you do to those men?" The thing smiled, showing perfectly normal teeth. "I'm a collector, Sheriff Williams. I collect bones. Human bones are particularly useful. They hold memories, experiences, knowledge. Those gentlemen provided me with very valuable materials." It walked further into the cabin, moving with normal human steps. But now I could see that the floor creaked wrong under its feet, like it weighed much more than it appeared to. "The process takes time," it continued, sounding almost conversational. "Removing the bones while keeping the flesh alive requires precision. Too fast, and they die before I can extract everything. Too slow, and they go into shock and become useless. I had my rifle trained on its center mass, but something told me bullets might not be effective. Still, it was all I had." "Ranger Grimm," it said, turning those black eyes toward me. 18 years of service, 12 years military before that. Sniper training. You're thinking about taking a shot." The thought had crossed my mind. You're welcome to try. But you should know that bullets can't damage something that doesn't really have a body. To prove its point, the thing reached up and pulled off its own head, just lifted it right off its shoulders and held it up like a hat. The head kept talking. "You see, gentlemen, I'm not actually here. This is just borrowed form, borrowed materials. The real me is much larger and currently occupied with construction projects." It put its head back on, straightening the collar of its ranger uniform. "Construction projects?" Agent Morrison managed to ask. "Oh yes, those bones I collected? I'm building things with them, wonderful things. An army, actually. Soldiers made from human skeletons, but with all the knowledge and training those skeletons once contained." The thing walked over to the storage room and gestured toward the boneless men. Dr. Patterson there was a surgeon for 30 years. His finger bones remember every operation. Mr. Collins was a mechanical engineer. His skull holds the knowledge of building bridges and buildings. Captain Morrison, yes, Agent Morrison, that's your brother in there, spent 20 years in the Army. His leg bones remember how to march in formation. Agent Morrison made a choking sound. I could see him staring at one of the flesh masses, recognizing something in what remained of the face. "You're build-it, Pam? An army out of dead people?" I asked. "Not dead, Ranger Grimm, very much alive. Death releases the memories too quickly. They need to remain conscious for the bone magic to work properly." The thing looked pleased with itself. I now have 17 highly educated, experienced skeletons working for me. Doctors, lawyers, engineers, military officers, each one retains the knowledge and skills of its original owner. Sheriff Williams was backing toward the door. "We need to get word out. People need to know." "Oh, people will know soon enough. My army is nearly complete. 17 new soldiers today, but I have hundreds more already active. Every cemetery and morgue in 3 counties has contributed to my cause." The thing gestured toward the window, and I could see movement in the forest beyond. Shapes walking between the trees, but walking wrong. Too stiff, too coordinated. They're patrolling the area now, making sure no one interferes with my work. Soon we'll move on to larger population centers. Think of the knowledge I could gain from a whole city full of bones. That's when I pulled the trigger. The bullet went right through where the thing's chest should have been and punched a hole in the wooden wall behind it. The ranger thing looked down at the hole, then back at me. As I said, Ranger Grimm, bullets don't work on something that isn't really there. But something had changed. The thing's form was flickering now, like a TV with bad reception. Whatever it was using to maintain this appearance was getting harder to hold together. "However," it said, its voice starting to sound different, "you've made things more difficult. I'll have to cut this conversation short." The ranger thing began to dissolve, starting from the feet up. As it faded, its voice changed from human to something else, something that sounded like wind blowing through hollow bones. "Ranger Grimm, you interest me. Your military experience, your knowledge of these mountains, your shooting skills. I think I'll save you for last. There's so much I could learn from your bones." And then it was gone, leaving only the smell of old graves and the sound of something large moving away through the forest outside. We got the 17 boneless men to the hospital in Abingdon, though I'm not sure what the doctors there could do for them. Each one was still conscious, still aware, trapped in flesh that couldn't move or speak properly. The sight of them being loaded into ambulances, 17 stretchers carrying what looked like bags of meat with human eyes, would stay with me forever. Agent Morrison confirmed that one of the victims was indeed his brother, a retired Army captain. That made things personal for the federal boys, which meant resources started flowing in fast. By that evening, we had military helicopters circling the forest and special operations teams setting up a command post at the ranger station. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. Over the next 3 days, reports came in from all over southwestern Virginia. Cemeteries found empty, graves dug up from the inside. Morgues broken into, but nothing stolen except the bodies. And sightings. People reporting figures walking through the forest at night, moving in perfect military formation. The thing calling itself a collector was building something big. On the 4th night, I was sitting in my cabin cleaning my rifle when I heard them coming. Not trying to hide, not sneaking around, just walking up my road in formation, their bone feet making that distinctive click-thud sound on the gravel. I looked out my front window and saw them clearly for the first time. 17 skeletons in perfect military formation, wearing the clothes they'd died in but moving like trained soldiers. In front was the skeleton that had been Dr. Patterson, still wearing his hunting jacket, but now walking with the precise steps of someone who'd never seen military service until his bones learned it from the Oturum. They're skeletons. Behind them came more, dozens more. Skeletons in burial suits, hospital gowns, casual clothes, all walking in perfect synchronization, all heading toward my cabin at the Yamu. Back of the formation was something that definitely wasn't human. 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur with arms that reached nearly to the ground. But it was walking upright like a man, and there was intelligence in its glowing yellow eyes. The real collector. The thing that had been appearing as a fake ranger. I grabbed my rifle, extra ammunition, and the military radio that connected me to the command post. Time to see if 18 years of ranger work and 12 years of military training were enough to stop a supernatural army. The formation stopped about 50 yards from my cabin, close enough that I could see the details I wished I couldn't. Dr. Patterson's skeleton still wore his wedding ring, the gold band somehow staying on finger bones that no longer had flesh. Captain Morrison's skeleton wore his army dress uniform, medals still pinned to ribs that were clearly visible through the fabric. The creature at the back stepped forward. When it spoke, its voice carried across the distance like it was standing right next to me. "Ranger Grimm, I told you I'd save you for last." I opened the window and aimed my rifle. "Yeah, well, I'm not ready to be saved just yet. Your bullets can't harm me as I demonstrated before. Maybe not, but I bet they can do some damage to your collection." I fired 3 quick shots at the skeleton formation. My bullets shattered 2 skulls and destroyed the rib cage of a 3rd skeleton. Those 3 collapsed immediately, becoming just piles of broken bone. The creature roared, a sound like wind howling through a cave system. "You cannot destroy what I have built. Each skeleton contains years of knowledge and experience." "Then I guess you better stop me." What followed was the strangest battle of my life. The skeletons moved like trained soldiers, taking cover behind trees, flanking around my cabin, coordinating their attacks. But they were still just bones held together by supernatural force. My bullets could shatter them, and my military training gave me advantages they hadn't expected. I moved from window to window, picking off skeletons with carefully aimed shots. Each one I destroyed seemed to enrage the creature more. It kept roaring orders in a language I didn't recognize, trying to coordinate its army like a general in a real battle. But there were too many of them. After 20 minutes of fighting, I was down to my last magazine. The skeletons had surrounded my cabin and were starting to break through the windows. My radio crackled with voices from the command post. They were sending helicopters, but it would take time I didn't have. That's when I remembered the propane tank behind my cabin, the one I used for my cook stove and lanterns. 50 gallons of liquid propane, enough to level half the mountain if it went up all at once. I grabbed my last flare from the emergency kit and kicked open my back door. The creature was standing right there waiting for me. Up close, it was even more horrible than I'd imagined. Ancient fur covered in grave dirt, hands that ended in claws longer than my fingers, and those yellow eyes that seemed to look right through me. "Your bones will be the centerpiece of my collection, Ranger Grimm. A man who spent his life protecting these mountains, now serving as the foundation for their conquest." "Sorry to disappoint you," I said, pulling the pin on the flare, "but I got other plans." I threw the flare toward the propane tank and dove behind a pile of firewood. The explosion lit up the whole mountain. 50 gallons of propane going off all at once creates a fireball that can be seen for miles. Every skeleton within 100 yards was instantly vaporized. Trees were knocked flat. The shock wave shattered windows in town 20 miles away. But when the smoke cleared and the ringing in my ears stopped, the creature was still standing, burned, missing patches of fur, clearly damaged, but still standing. "Ranger Grimm," it said, its voice now harsh and crackling. "You have cost me valuable materials. But you have also shown me why your bones will be so useful. Such tactical thinking, such willingness to sacrifice. Yes, you will make an excellent addition to my collection." It started walking toward me, and I realized I was out of options. No more ammunition, no more explosives, no more tricks. Just me and something that had survived a propane tank explosion. That's when the helicopters arrived. Military attack helicopters, the kind I'd called in airstrikes from during my tours overseas. They lit up the creature with machine gun fire and rockets, turning the area around my destroyed cabin into a war zone. But I could see it wasn't enough. The creature was damaged, slowed down, but not stopped. It roared at the helicopters and began climbing toward higher ground, moving deeper into the forest where the aircraft couldn't follow as easily. I grabbed the radio from where it had been thrown by the explosion. "Command post, this is Grimm. The target is heading north toward the old mine shafts. You need to evacuate everyone within 10 miles. This thing isn't done yet." The government boys did their best to keep the story quiet, but you can't hide military helicopters and explosions from people who live in the mountains. The official story was a gas leak explosion at my cabin, with some kind of terrorist activity that required military response. Most folks believed it, or at least pretended to. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital getting treated for burns and shrapnel wounds. During that time, teams of specialists combed through the forest, collecting bone fragments and trying to identify all the skeletons that had been destroyed. They found remains from over 200 people, bodies stolen from cemeteries and morgues across 3 states. The 17 boneless victims from Pine Ridge Camp never recovered. The doctors tried everything, but there's no medical procedure for replacing someone's entire skeleton. They lived for another month before their organs finally gave out. Agent Morrison sat by his brother's bedside every day until the end. I heard he retired from the FBI after that. As for the creature, the bone collector, it disappeared into the deep forest. Search teams found tracks leading toward the old abandoned mine shafts in the most remote part of the national forest, but the trail went cold at the entrance to a mine that had been sealed for 40 years. Sometimes at night, hikers still report hearing sounds from that area. Clicking sounds like bone hitting stone. And occasionally someone finds animal bones arranged in strange patterns or discovers that graves in remote mountain cemeteries have been disturbed. I got a new cabin farther from the deep forest, kept my rifle close and made sure I always had plenty of ammunition. The government offered me early retirement with full benefits, but I turned it down. These mountains are my responsibility, and I know there are things living in them that most people couldn't handle. About 6 months after the incident, I was checking on a campsite when I found something that made my blood run cold. 17 small piles of bones arranged in a perfect circle. Human bones, but tiny ones. Children's bones. They were arranged too carefully to be natural, too precisely to be the work of animals. I called it in to the command post, but by the time the specialists arrived, the bones were gone. No tracks, no signs of disturbance. Just empty ground where the piles had been. That night, I sat on my porch with my rifle across my knees and watched the tree line until dawn. I didn't see anything, but I felt watched. Something was out there in the darkness. Something that remembered me. The bone collector was still active, still building its army. But now it was being more careful, staying deeper in the forest, taking only what it needed from places where the disappearances wouldn't be noticed immediately. I know it's still out. There because sometimes, when the wind is right, I can hear them marching. The click-thud of skeleton feet moving through the forest in military formation, getting organized, getting ready for something. People ask me sometimes why I stay out here, why I don't take that early retirement and move somewhere safe. But there is nowhere safe, not really. The world is full of things that most people never see, things that hide in the spaces between normal life and the impossible. My name is Solomon Grimm, and I've been protecting these mountains for 18 years. Some threats you can stop with a bullet. Others you can slow down with explosives and military firepower. But some threats you can only watch for and try to be ready when they finally decide to show themselves again. In the deep forest, something is building an army of bones. And when it's ready, when it has enough soldiers made from the skeletons of the dead, it will march out of the mountains and into the world of the living. I'll be waiting, because that's what rangers do. We watch the wild places where normal people don't go, and we try to keep the darkness from spreading into the light. Even when we know we might not be enough to stop it. Even when we know that some battles can only be delayed, not won. The bone collector is patient. It has all the time in the world, but so do I. My name is Victor Kane, and I've been a forest ranger in these West Virginia mountains for 22 years. I've tracked every kind of animal you can think of. Bears, wolves, wild cats, even mountain lions that wandered down from up north. After Korea, I came back home to Canaan Valley, where my family's been living since before the Civil War. My wife, Sarah, died 3 years back from cancer, so now it's just me and my 3 hunting dogs in that little cabin by Blackwater Falls. Folks around here call me when they got trouble with predators killing their livestock. I know these woods better than the back of my hand. Every trail, every cave, every creek that runs through the Monongahela forest. In all my years, I never seen a track I couldn't identify or a kill I couldn't explain. That's what made me good at my job. It was October 15th, 1963, when everything changed. The leaves were turning gold and red, and there was that crisp smell in the air that comes right before the first snow. I was checking fence lines near the old logging roads when my radio crackled to life. "Victor, you there?" It was Sheriff Morrison from Tucker County. His voice sounded strange, kind of shaky. "I'm here, Bill. What's going on?" "We need you up at the Hendricks place. Something got to them last night." The Hendricks family lived in a farmhouse about 5 miles from my cabin. Good people. Tom Hendricks raised cattle and his wife Mary kept chickens. They had 3 kids, 2 boys and a little girl named Amy, who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. "Bear attack?" I asked, already heading back to my truck. "Victor, just get up here fast and bring your rifle." The tone in his voice made my stomach clench. In 22 years, I'd never heard Bill Morrison sound scared. I drove up the winding dirt road with my windows down, listening to the forest. Something felt wrong. The birds weren't singing, and I didn't see a single squirrel or chipmunk. Even my dogs in the back of the truck were whimpering and pressed against each other. 3 police cars sat in the Hendricks driveway, their red and blue lights flashing silent against the trees. Bill Morrison stood by his car, smoking a cigarette with hands that shook. When he saw me walking over, he threw the cigarette down and ground it under his boot. "It's bad, Victor. Real bad." "Where are they?" He pointed toward the tree line behind the house. "Scattered across about 200 yards. We found tracks, but..." He shook his head. "You're going to have to see for yourself." We walked through the backyard where Mary Hendricks used to hang her laundry. The clothesline was still there, but now it held something else. Strips of cloth that I realized were pieces of Tom's work shirt, torn and bloody. My trained eyes started taking in details automatically. Blood spatter on the chicken coop. Claw marks on the barn door that went too high for any bear I'd ever seen. Then I saw the first body. Tom Hendricks was spread across the base of a big oak tree. But something was wrong with how he looked. His head was twisted around backward, and his arms were missing. Not torn off like an animal would do. Cut clean, like with a knife. His chest was opened up, but nothing was eaten. Whatever did this wasn't hungry. It was playing. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. "That's not the worst of it," Bill said. "Keep walking." We found Mary Hendricks hung from a tree branch 30 feet away. Someone, or something, had tied her there with her own apron strings. Her body swayed in the breeze like a broken scarecrow. The 2 boys were further in the woods, placed in a circle with rocks around them, like some kind of ceremony. "Where's Amy?" I asked. Bill's face went pale. "We found her alive. She's in the ambulance." We walked back toward the house. The ambulance sat with its back doors open, and I could see little Amy Hendricks sitting on the stretcher. She was holding something in her small hands, and when I got closer, I realized it was her daddy's scalp. The strangest part was the sound she was making, not crying or screaming like you'd expect from a child who just lost her family. She was growling, low animal sounds from deep in her throat. When she saw me, she bared her teeth and snarled. "She's been doing that since we found her," one of the medics said. "Won't let go of that thing she's holding. Won't say a word, just makes those noises." I knelt down near the ambulance, careful not to get too close. "Amy, honey, it's Mr. Kane. You know me. I helped your daddy fix his fence last summer." She looked at me with eyes that seemed way too old for a 5-year-old girl. Then she threw back her head and let out a sound that made every hair on my body stand up. It was part howl, part scream, and part something else I couldn't name. "What kind of animal could do this?" Bill asked me. I walked back to where the bodies were and got down on my hands and knees to look at the tracks. The ground was soft from recent rain, so the prints were clear. What I saw didn't make sense. They looked like wolf tracks, but huge. bigger than any wolf that had lived in these mountains for 100 years. But here's the thing that really bothered me. Some of the prints showed 5 toes instead of 4, like fingers, like hands. I don't know, Bill, I said, standing up and brushing dirt off my knees. I honest to God don't know. 3 days later, I was still trying to figure out what happened to the Hendricks family when the next attack happened. This time it was 3 hunters from down in Elkins who'd come up to the mountains looking for deer. Their names were Jimmy Dalton, Pete Kowalski, and Mike Chen. Good men who knew the woods and knew how to handle themselves. They'd heard about the Hendricks killings and figured they were dealing with a rabid bear or maybe a pack of wild dogs. "We're gonna get this thing before it kills anybody else," Jimmy had told his wife before they left. I found them on the morning of October 18th, high up in the branches of 3 different trees, 40 feet off the ground, which was impossible unless something had thrown them up there. Their rifles were still strapped to their backs, but all the ammunition was gone. Every cartridge had been fired. Pete and Mike were already dead when I found them, but Jimmy was still breathing. Barely. He'd managed to tie himself to a branch with his belt, probably to keep from falling. His chest was opened up like a book, and I could see his heart still beating behind his ribs. "Jimmy," I called up to him. "I'm going to get help. Just hang on." His eyes found mine, and he tried to speak. Blood came out instead of words at first, but he kept trying. "What did this to you?" I asked. "Wolves," he whispered, so quiet I almost didn't hear him. "But they walked like men." I felt cold fingers crawl up my spine. "What?" "Stood up on their back legs, had hands, human hands." He coughed and more blood ran down his chin. "They talked to us, Victor. Used our voices. Called for help in our own voices." Jimmy died before the rescue team arrived, but not before he told me something else that kept me awake for the next week. "There's a whole pack of them," he'd said. 7, maybe 8. They hunt together. Smart. Smarter than any animal. His eyes rolled back, showing white. "They're still out there." I spent the next few days studying every book I could find about wolves and wild dogs. Called up some biology professors at West Virginia University, even talked to an old Cherokee man named Joseph Crow Feather, who lived over in Nicholas County. My grandfather had told me stories about him, said he knew things about these mountains that went back to before the white man came. "You're dealing with something that ain't quite wolf and ain't quite man," Joseph told me when I drove out to see him. "My people got stories about things like that, shapeshifters, skinwalkers, but we got a different name for them." "What do you call them?" "Dire wolf spirits. They've been sleeping in these mountains for a long time, waiting for the right moment to wake up. Something disturbed them." I didn't put much stock in ghost stories, but I was running out of practical explanations. These weren't normal animal attacks. The way the bodies were arranged, the surgical precision of the cuts, the fact that nothing was eaten, it all pointed to something with human intelligence. "How do you kill something like that?" I asked Joseph. He gave me a look that was half pity, half fear. "You don't kill them, Ranger Man. You run. You run far and you run fast, and you pray they don't follow you." But running wasn't in my nature. I'd tracked down every dangerous animal in these mountains for 22 years. I wasn't about to let some pack of overgrown wolves scare me off. That night I loaded my rifle with silver bullets. I know it sounds crazy, but Joseph had mentioned that silver was the only thing that could hurt them. I figured it was worth a try. I also took my 3 best hunting dogs, Rex, Duke, and Sadie, and we headed out to the area where Jimmy and his friends had been killed. The woods were dead quiet. No owls, no rustling leaves, no crickets. Just the sound of our boots on the forest floor and my dogs panting. Rex kept looking over his shoulder and whimpering, which wasn't like him. That dog had faced down bears without flinching. We were about 2 miles from where I'd found the hunters when Duke suddenly stopped and growled. The hair on his back stood straight up, and he was staring at something in the trees ahead of us. I raised my rifle and flicked on my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, showing nothing but empty forest. But I could feel something watching us. The air itself felt thick and wrong, like the pressure you get before a bad storm. Then I heard it. Voice calling from deeper in the woods. "Help me! Please, somebody help me!" It sounded like Jimmy Dalton, but Jimmy Dalton was dead. I'd watched them load his body into the coroner's van that morning. "Victor, help me, I'm hurt!" My dogs were backing up now, their tails between their legs. Sadie was actually shaking. In 10 years of hunting together, I'd never seen her scared of anything. The voice came again, closer this time. "Victor, please, it's Jimmy. I'm lost." That's when I realized what was happening. Whatever killed Jimmy had somehow learned his voice, was using it to try to lure me deeper into the woods. I backed away slowly, keeping my rifle ready. "Come on, boys," I whispered to my dogs. "We're getting out of here." But as we turned to leave, I saw them. Yellow eyes in the darkness, reflecting my flashlight like mirror. Not just 2 eyes. 6, 8, 10. A whole circle of them surrounding us. And then they started laughing. Human laughter, but wrong somehow. Too deep, too rough. The sound of men laughing with wolf throats. We ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. We ran back to the truck as fast as our legs could carry us. And we didn't stop until we were back in town with the doors locked and the lights on. But I knew this wasn't over. Whatever was out there in those mountains, it was just getting started. The state police showed up 2 days later. 6 troopers in 3 cars, led by a sergeant named Murphy, who thought he knew everything about handling dangerous animals. They set up a command post at the old fire station and started talking about organized hunts and bringing in helicopters. I tried to warn them, told them about Jimmy's last words, about the voices in the woods, about those yellow eyes watching us. Murphy just looked at me like I'd been drinking. "Ranger Kane, I appreciate your concern, but we're dealing with a pack of feral dogs here. Maybe some wolves that wandered down from Canada. Nothing a few good rifles can't handle." They went out on October 22nd, just as the sun was setting. Murphy and Trooper Collins took the north trail, while Troopers Baker and Williams headed south. They had radios, good equipment, and enough ammunition to stop a small army. I found them the next morning. Murphy and Collins were still in their patrol car, but the car was flipped upside down at the bottom of a ravine. Both men were inside, or what was left of them. Their service weapons were empty. 48 rounds fired between the two of them. The windshield was shattered from the inside, covered in claw marks that went through the safety glass like it was paper. Baker and Williams were worse. I found them hung from a tree branch by their own handcuffs, stripped naked and carved up like Thanksgiving turkeys. Someone had written words on the bark next to them. Not in English, strange symbols that looked almost like letters but weren't quite right. When Joseph Crow Feather came to look at the symbols, his face went white. "Territory markers," he said. "They're claiming this whole area as their hunting ground." What do the words say? Blood for the pack, meat for the young, fear for the spirits. He backed away from the tree. "Victor, you got to understand, these ain't just animals anymore. They're organizing, building something." The state police called in the National Guard after that. 30 soldiers with automatic weapons, night vision equipment, and helicopters. The commanding officer, Colonel Hayes, was a straight-talking man who listened when I told him what we were dealing with. "How many are we looking at?" he asked. "Jimmy Dalton said 7 or 8, but I think there might be more now." "More? You think they're recruiting?" I hadn't thought about it that way, but it made sense. The little girl, Amy Hendricks. She was acting like an animal after the attack, making growling sounds, baring her teeth. Colonel Hayes nodded grimly. "We've seen similar behavior in other states. Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky. Always the same pattern. Families wiped out, children left alive, but changed somehow." "You're saying this has happened before?" "Ranger Kane, what you're dealing with here is part of something much bigger. We've been tracking these incidents for the past 5 years, always in remote mountain areas, always the same kind of kills." The Guards set up camp near Blackwater Falls and started systematic patrols. They had motion sensors, thermal imaging, and enough firepower to level half the mountain. For 3 days, things were quiet. I almost started to think maybe the pack had moved on. Then, on the night of October 26th, all hell broke loose. I was in my cabin when the shooting started. Automatic weapons fire, lasting for maybe 10 minutes straight. Then screaming. Then silence. I grabbed my rifle and drove toward the guard camp as fast as my old truck would take me. What I found there still gives me nightmares. The camp looked like a tornado had hit it. Tents were shredded, equipment scattered everywhere. 6 of the soldiers were dead, torn apart, and arranged in that same ritual pattern I'd seen with the Hendricks family. But the other 24 were gone. Just gone. Colonel Hayes was alive. Barely. I found him pinned under a jeep with both his legs broken. His radio was still working, and he was trying to call for backup. "What happened?" I asked him. "They came out of nowhere," he gasped, moving together like a military unit. Coordinated attack. Some of them were walking upright, using tools. They had our weapons, Victor. They picked up our rifles and started shooting back at us. "How many?" "Too many to count. At least 20, maybe 30. He grabbed my arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "They took my men, dragged them off alive. I could hear them screaming from the woods." I stayed with Hayes until the medical helicopter arrived, but I knew the truth. Whatever we were dealing with had just gotten a lot stronger. It had weapons now, and it had hostages. That night, I called my brother Tommy down in Charleston and told him to take his family and get out of the state for a while. I called my sister Mary in Pittsburgh and gave her the same advice. I even tried to convince Joseph Crowfeather to leave, but he just shook his head. "This is my land," he said. "My people's bones are buried in these mountains. I ain't running." 2 days later, I found Joseph's cabin burned to the ground. His body was in the front yard, posed, sitting in his favorite chair like he was still alive. But his head was gone, replaced with a wolf skull that had been painted with his blood. On his front porch, written in that same strange language, was a new message. This one I could figure out without translation. "We are coming for you, Ranger Man." By November 1st, the whole area was under military quarantine. Nobody in, nobody out. The official story was a gas leak from an old mine shaft, but I knew better. They were trying to contain something that couldn't be contained. I'd been staying at the command post they set up in town, but I knew I couldn't hide forever. Whatever these things were, they wanted me specifically. Every message, every arranged body, every tactical strike had been building up to a final confrontation. That's when Sheriff Morrison came to me with news about the cockfight. "There's going to be an illegal fighting event tomorrow night," he said, "up at the old lumber camp near Dobson's Ridge. About 20, maybe 30 people expected. Bill, you got to call it off. Those people will be sitting ducks." I tried, but you know how these things work. Most of the folks going don't trust law enforcement. They think this whole quarantine is just the government trying to shut down their business. The old lumber camp had been abandoned since the 1940s, but the buildings were still solid. It was isolated, surrounded by thick woods, and about as far from help as you could get in these mountains. Perfect place for a massacre. I made up my mind. If these creatures wanted me, they could have me. But I wasn't going to let them slaughter a bunch of innocent people first. I loaded up with every weapon I could carry. My hunting rifle, a shotgun, 2 pistols, and enough ammunition for a small war. I also brought a gallon of gasoline, some road flares, and a box of dynamite left over from my mining days. If I was going down, I was taking some of them with me. The lumber camp sat in a clearing about 5 miles from the nearest road. I parked my truck a half-mile away and walked in through the woods, moving as quietly as I could. The sounds of the cockfight carried through the trees, men shouting, roosters crowing, the general noise of people having a good time. They had no idea what was coming for them. I climbed up into the loading tower of the old sawmill, which gave me a good view of the whole camp. 3 wooden buildings arranged around a central clearing, with cars and trucks parked everywhere. Through the windows, I could see people crowded around the fighting pit, drinking beer and placing bets. That's when I saw the first pair of yellow eyes in the tree line. Then another pair, and another. They were everywhere, surrounding the camp in a perfect circle. moving with the coordination of a military unit, just like Colonel Hayes had described. Some were on all fours, looking more like giant wolves. Others stood upright like men, but with the wrong proportions. Too tall, arms too long, heads too big. The attack began with silence. One of the men outside having a smoke just disappeared. There 1 second, gone the next. His cigarette fell to the ground, still glowing, but he was nowhere to be seen. Then another man went missing. And another. It took the people inside about 5 minutes to realize something was wrong. By then, it was too late. The creatures moved in perfect formation. Some went for the cars, ripping out engine parts so nobody could drive away. Others started setting fires around the buildings, trapping everyone inside. The smart ones, and they were definitely smart, took control of the roads and paths, cutting off any escape routes. That's when the screaming started. They herded the people like sheep, driving them from one building to another, picking them off one by one. I watched through my rifle scope as creatures that looked more human than wolf grabbed men by the throats and lifted them off the ground with one hand. I saw things that were definitely more wolf than human, using tools, opening doors, operating vehicles, even picking up dropped weapons and figuring out how to use them. The worst part was the voices. They'd learned to mimic the people they'd killed, and they used those voices to lure others into traps. I heard Jimmy Dalton's voice calling for help from 3 different directions. I heard Tom Hendricks shouting for his daughter. I even heard my own voice. Somehow, they'd learned to sound like me. 23 people died that night. I counted every one. But I also learned something important about these creatures. They weren't invincible. When I put a silver bullet through the head of one that was climbing up toward my hiding spot, it dropped like a stone. When I set off a stick of dynamite near a group of them, they scattered and howled like any animal would. They could be hurt, they could be killed, and they could feel fear. As the night went on, I picked them off one by one. My position in the loading tower gave me good cover and clear shots. Every time I dropped one of them, the others would hesitate, look around, try to figure out where the shots were coming from. But there were too many of them, and I was running out of ammunition. That's when I made my final move. I climbed down from the tower with my last stick of dynamite and a road flare, soaked everything in gasoline, and turned that lumber camp into the biggest bonfire these mountains had ever seen. The creatures fled into the woods, howling in rage and pain. But I'd hurt them badly. I'd shown them they weren't the only predators in these mountains. I'd also learned their weakness. Fire. They were afraid of fire. As I walked back to my truck through the burning wreckage of the camp, I could hear them calling to each other from the darkness. Not the voices of their victims this time, but their own voices. Wild, angry sounds that were part wolf howl and part human scream. They were planning their revenge, and they knew exactly where to find me. The final confrontation came 3 nights later at my own cabin. I was ready for them. I'd spent those 3 days turning my home into a fortress. Every window was boarded up except for small slots to shoot through. I'd scattered gasoline around the perimeter and set up tripwires connected to road flares. My hunting dogs were locked safely in the root cellar. I didn't want them getting hurt in what was coming. They arrived just after midnight on November 4th. I could hear them moving through the woods, trying to be quiet but not quite managing it. Whatever these things were, they'd gotten bigger since that first night. Stronger, more confident. The leader, and there was definitely a leader, called to me from the edge of the clearing around my cabin. "Victor Kane," it said, and the voice was almost human. Almost. "You killed our young. You burned our hunting ground. Now you pay." "Come and get me," I called back. What followed was a siege that lasted until dawn. They tried everything, setting fires, throwing rocks, even attempting to dig under the cabin foundation. But I'd thought of all that. Every time they got close, I lit up another section of the perimeter. Every time one of them showed itself, I put a silver bullet in it. By the time the sun came up, I'd killed 7 of them. Big ones, including the leader, a thing that stood nearly 8 feet tall, and had arms long enough to touch the ground when it walked upright. But I was out of ammunition, out of dynamite, and out of tricks. The 3 survivors could have finished me off, easily. Instead, they did something that still puzzles me to this day. They left, just gathered up their dead and melted back into the forest like smoke. I never saw them again in those mountains, but over the years I heard stories from other places. Similar attacks in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky, just like Colonel Hayes had said. Always the same pattern: coordinated hunts, ritual killings, voices that mimicked the dead. I started traveling, following the reports, became something between a hunter and a researcher, tracking these packs across the Appalachian region. I estimate they killed more than 200 people over the next 20 years, always staying ahead of law enforcement, always moving to new territory before they could be cornered. The government had files on them, I learned, classified studies dating back to the 1940s. They called them unknown biological entities and treated them like a military threat rather than a wildlife problem. There were theories about genetic experiments gone wrong, about ancient species awakening, about things that had always been in the mountains but were only now making themselves known. I never found out the truth. Maybe there isn't a single truth to find. What I did learn was that the pack I'd fought in West Virginia wasn't the only one. There were others scattered across the eastern mountains. They communicated somehow, shared information, learned from each other's mistakes, and they remembered their enemies. I spent 24 years hunting them, and they spent 24 years hunting me. Sometimes I'd go months without seeing any sign of them. Then I'd find a dead animal arranged in that familiar ritual pattern, or I'd hear my own voice calling to me from the woods, and I'd know they were still out there. The end came in 1987 in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. I'd tracked a pack there after a series of killings, GS near Gatlinburg. I was 64 years old by then, not as fast as I used to be, not as sharp, but I'd learned a lot about how they thought, how they hunted. I found their den in a cave system near Cades Cove. 7 adults and what looked like 3 young ones. I went in with my last stick of dynamite and a flare, planning to finish it once and for all. The explosion brought down half the mountain. They found my body 3 days later, torn apart but surrounded by the remains of the entire pack, every one of them dead. The cave system was completely collapsed, sealed forever. But sometimes on quiet nights in the mountains, people still hear voices calling from the woods. Voices of people who died long ago, asking for help that will never come. The pack is gone, but the mountains remember, and somewhere in those dark hollows and hidden valleys, new things are stirring, waiting for the right moment to hunt again. My name was Victor Kane, and this is the story I never got to tell while I was alive. I was a ranger for 22 years, a hunter for 24 more. I killed monsters that most people don't believe exist. But I also learned that some monsters are smart enough to wait, patient enough to plan, and angry enough to remember every slight, every loss, every drop of blood spilled. The mountains of Appalachia are old, older than human memory, and the things that live in their darkest places have been there longer than we have. They're still there now, waiting in the shadows between the trees, waiting for the next ranger who thinks he knows everything about the woods, waiting for you. My name is Augustus Thornwood, but everyone calls me Gus. I've been a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains for 31 years, and my daddy was a ranger before me and his daddy before him. At 58, I figure I've seen just about everything these old mountains can throw at a man. The morning it all started was October 15th, 1955. I remember the date because it was my granddaughter Sally's 7th birthday, and my wife Martha was making her special chocolate cake. The weather station showed clear skies, temperature holding steady at 62 degrees. Perfect autumn day for the campers down at Cataract Falls. I was checking the barometer in my station when the readings went crazy. Temperature dropped from 62 to 22 degrees in less than a minute. The pressure gauge spun like a compass near a magnet. Outside my window, I watched fog roll down from the peaks faster than any weather system I'd ever seen. This wasn't normal mountain mist. It moved wrong, flowing uphill against the wind, thick as cotton and gray as old bones. The fog bank stretched maybe 200 yards across, moving through the valley like it had a mind of its own. I grabbed my binoculars and radio, heading out to my observation deck. Through the field glasses, I could make out the Henderson family campsite right in the fog's path. Tom Henderson, his wife Carol, and their twin boys were setting up their tent, completely unaware of what was coming. "Henderson Camp, this is Ranger Station 7, I called on the radio. Static answered me back. "Tom, if you can hear this, you need to pack up and move to higher ground immediately." Nothing. The radio was dead as a doornail. I watched through the binoculars as the fog swallowed their campsite. For maybe 3 minutes, everything went quiet except for the sound of my own breathing. Then the screaming started. It wasn't human screaming. It was something else, something that made the hair on my neck stand up and my hands shake. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, getting louder and more desperate. When the fog finally moved on, I could see the campsite again. The Hendersons were still there, walking around their camp in slow, jerky movements. But something was wrong with the way they moved, like old people struggling to walk. I radioed for backup and started down the trail. It took me 20 minutes to reach their campsite, and by the time I got there, I wished I hadn't. Tom Henderson was sitting by his cold campfire, but he looked like he'd aged 40 years. His hair was white as snow, his face covered in deep wrinkles. His hands were spotted with age, shaking as he tried to light a cigarette with fingers that barely worked. Carol was worse. She lay on the ground near their tent, breathing in short, raspy gasps. Her blonde hair had turned gray and brittle. When she looked at me, her eyes were clouded with cataracts. The boys. God help me. Those 8-year-old boys looked like they were 80. They sat on a log, holding each other and crying with voices that cracked like old men. "What happened here?" I asked Tom. He turned to look at me, and I saw terror in those ancient eyes. "The mist," he whispered. "Something in the mist. It touched us, and we got old. So old." Carol died while I was radioing for medical help. Just stopped breathing, like her body had given up after decades of wear it never should have experienced. The boys lasted another hour before their hearts gave out. Tom made it to the hospital, but he was gone by morning. The doctors said they'd never seen anything like it. 4 healthy people, aged to death in the space of a few minutes. They ran tests, checked for radiation, chemicals, anything that might explain it. Found nothing. I knew they wouldn't, because I'd seen that. Fog. And I knew it wasn't natural. In 31 years of mountain service, through blizzards and floods and forest fires, I'd never seen anything that scared me like that gray mist. That night, sitting in my kitchen while Martha served Sally her birthday cake, I made myself a promise. Whatever that thing was, whatever had killed the Henderson family, I was going to stop it before it hurt anyone else. I had no idea what I was up against. No idea that some things in these mountains were older than the trees, older than the rocks themselves, and hungry for something no human being should ever have to give up. 3 days later, it happened again. I was making my morning rounds when I got the call from Jake Morrison, one of the younger rangers. His voice was shaky on the radio. "Gus, you need to get down to the Elkmont campground, now." "What's the situation?" Jesus, Gus, it's bad, real bad." I found Jake standing at the edge of the campground, pale as milk and smoking his 3rd cigarette in a row. He pointed toward the woods with a trembling hand. "Boy Scout troop from Knoxville," he said. 12 kids and 3 leaders. They were on a nature hike when that fog came through." The same fog. I could see wisps of it still clinging to the trees, even though the morning sun should have burned it off hours ago. It moved like smoke, but it felt alive, watching us. "Where are they now?" "Follow me." "But Gus, prepare yourself." We walked down a forest trail I'd hiked 1,000 times before. But everything felt wrong. The birds weren't singing. The squirrels weren't chattering. Even the insects had gone quiet, like the whole forest was holding its breath. We found the scout leaders first, 3 men who should have been in their 30s and 40s, now nothing but dried-up corpses sitting around a dead campfire. Their scout uniforms hung loose on shrunken bodies. Their faces were leather and bone, eyes sunken deep in their skulls. But it was the boys that broke my heart. 12 kids between the ages of 10 and 14, all of them aged into old men overnight. They sat in a circle holding hands, their young faces now wrinkled and spotted with age. Their voices, when they tried to speak, cracked and wheezed like they'd been smoking for 60 years. "Help us," one of them whispered. His name tag said Billy, but he looked like somebody's grandfather. "Something happened to us. We hurt so bad." I knelt down beside Billy, careful not to touch him. "What do you remember?" "We were hiking," he said, tears running down his ancient cheeks. Then the fog came. It was cold, so cold, and there was something in it. Something big and hairy that smelled like old things, dead things. Did you see it clearly? Billy nodded, his white hair falling across his forehead. It was tall as the trees, had long arms and glowing eyes. When it touched us, everything started hurting, like fire running through our bones. I stayed with those boys until the medical team arrived. One by one, their old hearts gave out. Billy was the last to go, gripping my hand with fingers that felt like tree bark. "Stop it," he whispered with his final breath. "Don't let it hurt anyone else." That night I went to the Cherokee Reservation to talk to Joseph Crow Feather, the tribal historian. If anyone would know about strange things in these mountains, it would be him. Joseph was 83 years old, but still sharp as a tack. He listened to my story without interruption, nodding like he'd heard it all before. "Time walker," he said finally. "That's what my grandfather called it. A Sasquatch that learned the old magic, the forbidden kind that messes with the flow of years. You're telling me this thing is real? Real as the mountains themselves. My people have stories going back hundreds of years. It was a shaman once, they say, but it got greedy. Wanted to live forever, so it made a deal with the shadow spirits. Now it steals time from the living to keep itself young." Joseph pulled out an old leather book, its pages yellow with age. "According to legend, it shows up every few decades when it gets hungry. Last time was 1923 during the Big Flood. Before that, 1891. He showed me drawings that made my blood run cold. A massive humanoid figure surrounded by swirling mist, reaching out to touch human victims who withered away like flowers in winter. How do you stop something like that? Joseph closed the book and looked at me with sad eyes. The stories say only one way. Someone has to trap it between time and no time, in a place where all moments exist at once. But whoever does it, he shook his head. They don't come back the same, if they come back at all. I drove home through mountain roads that seemed darker than usual, past trees that looked like they were reaching for my truck. The fog was getting thicker, and I could swear I saw shapes moving inside it. When I got home, Martha was waiting up for me, her face full of worry. "Gus, there's something wrong with the weather," she said. "It's been snowing in the backyard, but only in one spot. And the roses, they bloomed and died 3 times today." I looked out the kitchen window and felt my heart sink. Patches of fog were drifting around our house, and wherever they touched, strange things happened. The grass grew tall and then withered away. A bird landed on the fence and aged to death in seconds, falling off as a tiny skeleton. The Time Walker wasn't just hunting random campers anymore. It was getting bolder, coming closer to civilization, and for some reason, it seemed to be focusing on me. The next morning, I woke up to Martha screaming. I ran to the bathroom and found her staring at herself in the mirror. Her brown hair had silver streaks that hadn't been there the night before. Fine lines had appeared around her eyes, and her hands looked older, the skin looser than it should be. "Gus, what's happening to me?" Before I could answer, our granddaughter Sally came running in from the backyard crying. She was still 7 years old, but Her pigtails had gone gray overnight. "Grandpa, the swing set got old," she sobbed. "It fell down and it's all rusty and broken." I looked out the window and saw what she meant. Our wooden swing set, which I'd built just last summer, now looked like it had been rotting for 20 years. The ropes had snapped, the wood was gray and crumbling, and the metal chains were eaten through with rust. Patches of that gray fog clung to our yard like cobwebs. Wherever it touched, things aged rapidly. The oak tree I'd planted when Sally was born was now bent and twisted, its leaves brown and falling. Our vegetable garden had withered to nothing but dead stalks. "Pack some bags," I told Martha. "You and Sally are going to stay with your sister in Gatlinburg until this is over. What about you?" "I've got work to do." After they left, I spent the day studying everything I could find about the Time Walker legend. The Cherokee stories all said the same thing. The creature fed on human life force, stealing years to keep itself young and powerful, but it was getting greedier, taking more than it needed. That afternoon, I got 3 more reports. A maintenance crew working on the Appalachian Trail had been found dead, their bodies mummified like they'd been buried in the desert for 50 years. A family of hikers had disappeared completely, leaving only their clothes and cameras behind. And a group of researchers studying weather patterns had sent one final radio message. "Something's in the fog with us. Dear God, it's taking our..." Then static. I found the researchers at their campsite on Mount LeConte. 8 men and women who'd been young and healthy that morning were now nothing but dried husks sitting around their equipment. Their notebooks showed increasingly frantic weather readings before the entries stopped mid-sentence. But this time, I saw something that made me understand how the creature worked. Their cameras had been running when the attack happened, and the film showed everything. The fog rolled in at 2:47 p.m. according to the timestamp. For the first few minutes, nothing seemed wrong except for the unnatural cold. Then shapes began moving in the mist, dark shadows that didn't match anything human. At 2:52, the creature emerged. It stood 12 feet tall, covered in dark brown fur matted with age and moisture. Its arms were longer than a man's entire body, ending in clawed hands that seemed to shimmer with their own gray light. But it was the eyes that made me sick to my stomach. Ancient, intelligent eyes that glowed like coals in a face that was almost human, almost ape, but something else entirely. When it touched the first researcher, I watched her age 40 years in 10 seconds. Her hair went from brown to gray to white, her face wrinkled like a raisin, her body shrinking as it lost decades of life. The creature seemed to breathe in her stolen years, its own fur becoming darker and thicker. By the time it was finished with all 8 researchers, the Time Walker looked younger and stronger than when it had arrived. It turned toward the camera with those burning eyes, and I swear it smiled before the film went black. I was studying the footage when my radio crackled to life. "Gus, this is Jake. You need to get down to the visitor center, now." "What's wrong?" "It's here, Gus. The fog's surrounding the building, and there are 37 tourists trapped inside. Whatever that thing is, it's not hiding anymore." I grabbed my rifle and emergency kit, though I doubted either would do much good against something that could control time itself. As I drove toward the visitor center, I could see the massive fog bank ahead of me, bigger than ever before. Lightning flickered inside it, but there was no thunder. Instead, I heard something worse, the sound of time itself being twisted and broken, like the groaning of old wood under too much weight. The visitor center sat in the middle of the fog like a ship in a gray sea. I could see faces pressed against the windows, tourists and staff watching in terror as shapes moved through the mist around them. Every few minutes, the fog would pulse brighter, and I'd hear screaming. I parked at the edge of the fog bank and tried the radio. Dead silence. My watch had stopped working, its hands spinning wildly before freezing at 11:43. The temperature gauge in my truck showed impossible readings, jumping from freezing to boiling and back again. That's when I saw my first ghost. Tom Henderson stepped out of the fog, looking exactly like he had before the creature aged him to death. He walked right up to my truck window and tapped on the glass. "Gus," he said in his normal voice, "you have to help us. It's got us trapped between the times. We can't move on, can't go back. We're stuck. Tom? But you're dead. Dead. Alive. What's the difference when time don't work right? The thing's got so much power now. It's breaking the rules. Past, present, future. It's all mixing together. More figures emerged from the fog. The Boy Scouts, looking like normal kids again. The research team, young and healthy. All the creatures' victims caught between life and death, between the seconds that made up their stolen years. How do I stop it? Tom's ghostly form flickered like a bad TV signal. You got to get it confused, make it experience all times at once. But Gus, his voice was fading. Once you step into that fog, you might not come back out the same. Time does things to a person. I looked at the visitor center where real people were counting on me to save them. Then I looked at my truck, my escape route back to safety. There wasn't really a choice to make. I stepped into the fog and felt myself fall backward through 40 years of my own life. The moment I entered the fog, everything changed. I was 8 years old again, standing in these same mountains with my father, learning to read animal tracks. Then I was 25, coming home from Korea with shrapnel scars and nightmares. 32, holding my newborn daughter for the first time, 50D. Burying my father on a rainy Tuesday in March. All of it happening at the same time, layered on top of each other like double-exposed photographs. I could feel every age I'd ever been, remember things that hadn't happened yet, forget things that were happening right now. The Time Walker stood in the center of it all, feeding off the chaos. Up close, it was even more terrible than the camera had shown. Its fur was streaked with silver and black, and I could see the faces of its victims reflected in its eyes. Dozens of people, maybe hundreds, all the lives it had stolen over the centuries. When it breathed, gray mist poured from its mouth and nose, carrying the smell of old bones and forgotten graves. "You cannot stop what has always been," it said in a voice like grinding stone. "I am time itself, Ranger. I am the moment between one heartbeat and the next, the pause between inhale and exhale. You are nothing but a brief flicker in an endless night." It reached for me with those impossible hands, and I felt decades of my life trying to drain away. My hair started going gray, my joints began to ache with age I hadn't earned yet, but something Joseph Crow Feather had said came back to me about trapping the creature between time and no time. I thought about my radio, broken by the temporal distortions, my watch, spinning wildly before it stopped, all the electronic equipment that failed when the creature was near. It wasn't just affecting living things. It was disrupting anything that depended on precise timing. "You're not time," I gasped, fighting against the aging effect. "You're just stealing it. Like a thief breaking into houses, taking what don't belong to you." The creature's eyes flared brighter, and I felt more years being pulled from me. But I also felt something else, the echo of all the lives it had taken, the weight of all those stolen years pressing down on it. Ike Mountain. That's when I understood what Joseph had meant about confusion. I pulled out my father's old pocket watch, a railroad timepiece that had kept perfect time for 60 years. The creature's power had stopped it at 11:43, but the gears inside were still trying to move, fighting against the temporal distortion. "You want time?" I said, forcing myself to stand straight even as my body tried to age. "Take all of it." I smashed the watch face against a rock, and something incredible happened. All the compressed time inside the mechanism exploded outward like a broken dam. Every second the watch had ever counted, every minute and hour it had measured, all of it at once. The creature screamed as decades of precisely measured time crashed into it from all directions. Its carefully hoarded power began to unravel as it was forced to experience every moment it had ever stolen simultaneously. I watched as it aged and grew young again, over and over, cycling through centuries in seconds. Its fur turned white, then black, then brown, then silver. Its massive body shrank and swelled as different ages fought for control. But it wasn't enough. The creature was too old, too powerful. It began to stabilize, its form becoming solid again. Those burning eyes focused on me with pure hatred. "Clever," it growled. "But mortal cleverness cannot triumph over eternal hunger." It lunged for me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed onto its arm as those claws reached for my throat, letting its power flow directly into me while I held on tight. What happened next was like being caught in a tornado made of memories. I experienced every moment of my life at once. My first kiss, my last goodbye to my father, the day I became a ranger, the moment I first held my granddaughter. But I also experienced every moment the creature had lived through, centuries of hunting, feeding, growing stronger on stolen years. More than that, I experienced every moment its victims had been robbed of. Tom Henderson's retirement he never got to enjoy. The Boy Scouts growing up, getting married, having children of their own, all the birthdays and anniversaries and quiet moments that had been torn away. The weight of all those lost possibilities was crushing. But it was also a weapon. I forced the creature to feel what I was feeling. The guilt of every stolen moment, the sorrow of every life cut short, the loneliness of existing outside the normal flow of time. For something that had spent centuries taking without giving, being forced to experience genuine human emotion was like poison. It tried to let go of me, but I held on with everything I had. Around us, the fog began to collapse in on itself as the creature's power turned inward. The temporal distortions that had been spreading across the mountains reversed, snapping back like a rubber band. I felt myself aging again, but this time it was different. Natural aging, the kind that comes with wisdom and experience rather than theft. I could feel my hair going white, my face lining with years I'd earned honestly. The Time Walker was shrinking, its stolen power bleeding away as it was forced to confront the reality of what it had done. All those centuries of artificial youth were catching up with it at once. "You don't understand," it whispered as its form began to fade. "Without me, time flows wrong in this place. The mountains need someone to watch over the years, to keep the past from bleeding into the present." "Maybe," I said, still holding tight as we both grew older together. "But it don't have to be you anymore." The creature looked at me with something that might have been gratitude before it crumbled away like ancient paper, dissolving into mist that sparkled once before disappearing forever. The fog cleared, and I found myself standing in front of the visitor center, surrounded by confused but alive tourists. My radio crackled back to life, and I could hear Jake calling my name. But when I looked at my reflection in the visitor center window, I barely recognized myself. My hair was completely white, my face lined with deep wrinkles. My hands were spotted with age, and I moved with the careful steps of a much older man. The Time Walker was gone, but its final gift to me had been 20 years of natural aging in the span of 20 minutes. That was 6 months ago, and I'm writing this story down because folks deserve to know what really happened in the mountains that October. The official reports say it was a chemical spill from an old mining operation, something that caused rapid aging in anyone who got exposed. The government boys came in with their suits and clipboards, took statements, and sealed the whole thing up tight. But I know the truth, and so did the Cherokee. Joseph Crowfeather visits me sometimes, and we talk about the old stories and what they mean for folks today. He says the Time Walker's gone for good, but that doesn't mean the mountains are entirely safe. There are other things sleeping in the deep woods, other legends that might wake up hungry. Martha took my rapid aging better than I expected. "You're still my Gus," she said when I came home looking like her grandfather instead of her husband. "Just with a few more miles on you." She's had to help me more than I'd like, but we're managing. Sally was confused at first, asking why Grandpa had gotten so old so fast. I told her I'd been sick, which wasn't exactly a lie. She seems to accept it, though sometimes I catch her staring at me with worried eyes that are too old for a 7-year-old face. The aging stopped after that first day, thank God. Whatever the creature did to me, it was a one-time thing. I'm stuck looking like I'm pushing 80, but at least I'm not getting any older faster than normal. I retired from the Park Service, of course. Hard to explain to your supervisors why you suddenly need 20 years' worth of medical benefits. Jake Morrison took over my territory, and he's a good ranger. I made sure to tell him about all the places where strange things happen, all the spots where the old legends still hold power. Sometimes, on foggy mornings, I still get nervous. I'll check the weather reports 3 times and keep my radio handy, just in case. But the mist that rolls through the valleys now is just regular mountain fog, the kind that burns off when the sun gets high enough. The visitor center has a new display about weather safety in the mountains. It warns hikers to avoid areas with unusual fog formations and to report any sudden temperature drops to the ranger stations immediately. Most folks probably think it's just standard safety advice, but those of us who know better understand what it really means. I've been thinking about what the Time Walker said before it died, about the mountains needing someone to watch over the years. I don't think it was lying about that part. These old mountains have seen a lot of history, and sometimes the past does try to bleed through into the present. Maybe that's why my family has been here for 3 generations, why we become rangers and learn the mountain's secrets, not to control time like that creature did, but to stand guard against the things that shouldn't be allowed to wake up. Last week, I got a letter from a ranger station in the Rockies. Similar incidents, he said. Unexplained aging, missing hikers, fog that moves against the wind. He'd heard through the grapevine that I might know something about that kind of thing. I wrote him back with everything I could remember about stopping the Time Walker. Some knowledge is too dangerous to keep to yourself, especially when innocent people might be in danger. I also sent him Joseph Crow Feather's address. If there's another one of those creatures out there, he's going to need all the help he can get. The old stories exist for a reason, and the people who remember them are our best defense against the things that hunt in, the spaces between seconds. Martha found me writing this story at the kitchen table last night, my hands shaking a little as I tried to remember all the details correctly. "You think folks will believe it?" she asked. "Some will," I said. "The ones who need to." She kissed the top of my white head and went to check on Sally, who was having nightmares again. The little girl still sometimes wakes up crying about the fog, even though she was safe at her aunt's house when everything happened. But children know things sometimes, things adults have forgotten how to see. Maybe that's why the creature targeted the young ones. Not just for their years, but because they could sense its presence in ways grown-ups couldn't. I keep this story in a safe place, along with the photographs from the research team and Joseph's Book of Legends. If something similar ever happens again, if another Time Walker wakes up hungry in some other mountain range, at least there will be a record of how to fight it. The mountains are quiet now, peaceful in the way they should be. But I still listen to the wind in the trees, still watch the way the fog moves through the valleys. Because I learned something that October that I'll never forget. Time is the most precious thing any of us have, and there are creatures in this world that would steal every second of it if we let them. My name is Augustus Thornwood, and I've been keeping watch over these mountains for more than 30 years. The Time Walker is gone, but my job isn't finished. It never really is. Final word count, 4,127 words, approximately 15 minutes reading time. My name is Diana Ravencrest, and I need to tell you what really happened in the Chattahoochee National Forest in the summer of 1981. The official reports say it was a gas leak that killed those people. They're lying. I'd been a forest ranger for 4 years by then, working the Archaeological Protection Unit up near Brasstown Bald. Most people don't know we have units like that, but when you've got ancient Native American sites scattered through federal land, somebody has to make sure treasure hunters and developers don't destroy them. That somebody was me. I wasn't supposed to be doing this job. 4 years earlier, I'd been finishing my PhD in anthropology at the University of Georgia, writing my dissertation on Cherokee burial practices. I was the first person in my family to even finish high school, let alone go to college. My parents thought I was crazy for walking away from a teaching position to become a ranger, but I couldn't stand being stuck in classrooms anymore. I wanted to protect the real history, not just write papers about it. The morning everything started, I was drinking coffee on the porch of the ranger station when Dr. Martin Welsh pulled up in his dusty Jeep. Martin was leading an archaeological team from Emory University, documenting burial mounds before the Forest Service built new hiking trails through the area. He was a good man, careful, respectful of the sites we were working with. "Diana, we need to talk," he said, climbing out of his vehicle. His face was pale, and his hands shook as he reached for his coffee mug. "What's wrong?" I asked. Martin was usually calm, even when we found evidence of looting or vandalism. "It's the Caldwell Mound," he said, naming the largest burial site in our sector. "We started the initial excavation yesterday, just surface mapping, but something's not right." I followed him to his Jeep, where he pulled out a folder of photographs. The first few showed normal archaeological work, string grids, measuring tools, careful brushwork on ancient soil. But the last photo made my stomach turn. Where the team had been working, the ground was dark red, almost black. It looked like blood, but blood doesn't pool like that in dry soil. It doesn't stay wet for hours in 90-degree heat. "The temperature dropped 30 degrees when we started digging," Martin said. "In the middle of July, Diana, my thermometer read 58 degrees right over the excavation site." I'd studied Cherokee folklore extensively during my graduate work. I knew the stories about places that should be left alone, burial grounds that were sealed for good reason. But I was a scientist. I believed in facts, evidence, rational explanations. "Groundwater can create temperature variations," I said, though I didn't sound convincing even to myself. "And that discoloration could be iron oxide deposits reacting to air exposure." Martin shook his head. "Come see for yourself. My whole crew is spooked. 2 of them refused to come back today." We drove the 20 minutes to the Caldwell site in silence. The burial mound sat in a clearing surrounded by old-growth pines, their shadows creating a natural ring around the ancient earthwork. Cherokee oral tradition said this particular mound was built to contain something, not just honor the dead. The tribal elders I'd interviewed always got uncomfortable when I asked about it. As we approached the excavation area, I felt the temperature change Martin had described. It was like walking into an air-conditioned building, except we were outside in direct sunlight. The hair on my arms stood up, and I could see my breath. The ground where they'd been digging was wrong. Not just the color, though it was definitely blood red now, but the texture. It moved slightly, like it was brilliant, thin. The shadows cast by the pine trees seemed darker here, more solid somehow. "Dr. Welsh," called a voice from the tree line. Sarah Chen, one of Martin's graduate students, emerged from the forest. Her face was white with terror. "You need to see this." She led us to where the team had set up their equipment station, about 50 yards from the main dig site. Their tools were scattered across the ground, brushes, measuring devices, cameras, as if people had dropped everything and run. "We were cataloging artifacts when it happened," Sarah said, her voice shaking. Jim was taking photographs of the site when he looked at his camera screen and started screaming. She handed us a digital camera and scrolled through the images. The first few showed normal archaeological work, but in the last photo, taken just an hour earlier, something was wrong with the shadows. In the picture, 5 people stood around the excavation site, but there were 6 shadows on the ground. The extra shadow was reaching toward the nearest person, Jim, the photographer. Its shadow arm stretched impossibly long, almost touching his foot. "Jim threw the camera and ran," Sarah continued. Then Mary looked at the ground and saw that her shadow was moving by itself, reaching for her legs. We all ran. I stared at the photograph. As a scientist, I knew there had to be an explanation. Camera malfunction, double exposure, something rational. But the temperature around the burial mound was still dropping, and I could hear sounds from the excavation site that didn't belong in a forest. Whispers, scraping noises, something that sounded like crying. "Where's your crew now?" I asked Martin. "Back in town. Half of them want to abandon the site entirely." I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Let's take a closer look at the mound. Whatever's happening, we need to document it properly before we can make any decisions. As we walked back toward the burial site, our shadows preceded us on the ground, and for just a moment, I could have sworn my shadow turned its head to look back at me. The next morning, I arrived at the Caldwell site alone. Martin's team had officially suspended operations, citing environmental concerns. But I couldn't let go of what we'd seen. As a ranger, it was my job to understand what was happening on federal land. As an anthropologist, I needed to know what we'd disturbed. I brought every piece of scientific equipment I could find: thermometers, cameras, soil testing kits, even a seismograph to check for underground activity. If something natural was causing these phenomena, I was going to document it properly. The temperature anomaly was still there, a perfect circle of cold air around the burial mound. My digital thermometer read 42 degrees at the excavation site, while just 10 feet away it climbed back to 86 degrees. I took photographs, soil samples, measured the exact boundaries of the cold zone. That's when I noticed the shadows were wrong. It was 10 in the morning, bright sunshine filtering through the pine canopy. The shadows of the trees should have been pointing northwest. Instead, every shadow near the burial mound pointed directly toward the excavation site, as if the disturbed earth was pulling them in. I knelt down and placed my hand near the edge of my own shadow. The shadow moved. Not the way shadows move when you shift your position, but independently, like it was alive. My shadow hand reached toward the burial mound while my real hand stayed perfectly still. I jerked my hand away and scrambled backward. The shadow snapped back to normal position like a rubber band. My radio crackled to life. "Diana, this is base. We just got a call about the archaeological site. You need to get out of there now." "What kind of call?" I asked, still staring at my shadow. "Jack Morrison, the construction foreman working on the new trail. He's at the hospital. Says something attacked him at the Caldwell site." I knew Jack. He was a tough man who'd been building trails in these mountains for 15 years. Nothing spooked him. "What kind of attack?" "Diana, just get out of there. We're sending backup." But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had to understand what was happening. I approached the excavation site carefully, noting how the shadows seemed to writhe and reach toward me as I got closer. The bloody discoloration in the soil had spread overnight, covering an area twice the size of yesterday's disturbance. Then I heard the voice. "Help me!" It came from the burial mound itself, muffled and distant like someone calling from underground. I grabbed my portable shovel and carefully scraped away loose soil from the excavation area. "Help me, please." The voice was clearer now, definitely coming from below the surface. Someone was trapped down there. Every rational part of my brain told me this was impossible. The mound was solid earth, undisturbed for centuries except for our surface work. But someone was calling for help. I dug faster, following proper archaeological technique even in my panic. 6 inches down, my shovel hit something hard. I brushed away the dirt and revealed carved stone covered in symbols I recognized as Cherokee script. The moment I touched the stone, the voice changed. "Free me." It wasn't a plea anymore. It was a command, spoken in a voice that was definitely not human. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and frost began forming on the pine needles around the clearing. I stumbled backward and ran for my truck, my shadow racing ahead of me across the ground. But as I reached for the door handle, my shadow grabbed my wrist. I felt it. Cold, solid pressure around my arm, holding me in place. I looked down and saw my shadow hand gripping my real wrist, preventing me from opening the truck door. The shadow was 3-dimensional now, substantial enough to physically restrain me. "You woke me up," the voice said, and this time it came from my own shadow. "You can't leave now." I yanked my arm free with all my strength and dove into the truck. As I started the engine, I saw in my rearview mirror that every shadow in the clearing, tree shadows, equipment shadows, the long shadow of the burial mound itself, was reaching toward my vehicle like grasping hands. I drove straight to the hospital in town where I found Jack Morrison in the emergency room, sedated and bandaged. The nurse told me he'd been found unconscious at the construction site with strange marks around his throat. "Strangled," she said quietly. "But the weird thing is, there were no fingerprints, no evidence of human contact at all. Just these dark marks on his neck, like he'd been grabbed by something made of shadow." When Jack woke up, he told me what happened. He'd been working alone, clearing brush near the burial mound, when his shadow started moving independently. At first he thought it was funny, tried to make it dance, But then the shadow reached up from the ground and grabbed his throat. "It was my own shadow, Diana," he whispered. "My own shadow tried to kill me." That evening, I drove to the Cherokee Reservation to speak with Elder Joseph Crowfeather. I'd interviewed him several times during my graduate research, and he'd always been helpful, sharing stories and cultural context that weren't available in written records. But when I told him what was happening at the Caldwell site, his face went gray. "You shouldn't have disturbed that place," he said. "That mound wasn't built to honor the dead. It was built to keep something buried." "What kind of something?" I asked. Joseph was quiet for a long time, staring into the distance. Finally, he spoke. "My grandfather called it the Shadow Walker, a spirit that feeds on life through darkness itself. Long ago, it nearly destroyed our people. The medicine men bound it beneath the earth, sealed it with stones and prayers and the sacrifice of their own lives. That mound is its prison. And now we've damaged the seal? Now it's waking up, and it's hungry." As I drove home that night, I noticed my headlights weren't working properly. The beams seemed weaker, less able to push back the darkness, and in my rearview mirror, the shadows behind my truck looked deeper, more solid, like they were following me home. The killings started 3 days later. Dr. Martin Welsh was found dead in his hotel room at dawn. The official cause was heart failure, but I knew better when I saw the crime scene photos. Martin's shadow was burned into the carpet beneath his body, a perfect silhouette that remained even after the body was removed. The shadow was darker than any stain should be, and when I touched it, the carpet was ice cold. The second victim was Mary Caldwell, the local historian who'd been helping Martin research the burial site. She was found in her backyard, surrounded by the scattered pages of her research notes. The sheriff said it looked like she'd been running from something, but there were no footprints, no signs of pursuit, except for the shadows. Mary's neighbor told me she'd been looking out her window when it happened. She saw Mary running across the yard, screaming about shadows chasing her. But when she looked more carefully, she realized Mary wasn't being chased by someone else's shadows. She was being hunted by multiple versions of her own shadow. "There were 5 or 6 of them," the neighbor whispered when I interviewed her. "All exactly Mary's shape. But they moved wrong, like they were made of liquid darkness. They surrounded her and they tore her apart." I found the scattered research notes in Mary's yard. Most were illegible, soaked with blood, but I managed to piece together fragments of what she'd discovered. References to Cherokee binding rituals, mentions of a shadow entity that could possess darkness itself, and a hand-drawn map showing the exact location of similar burial sites throughout the region. According to Mary's notes, there were 12 sealed sites in the Chattahoochee National Forest. The Caldwell Mound was just one of them. That night, I started getting phone calls from other rangers in the region. Strange reports were coming in from across a 50-square-mile area. Campers found dead in their tents, with no signs of violence except for dark stains beneath their bodies. Hikers discovered along trails, their shadows permanently burned into the ground. The most disturbing report came from a family camping near Vogel State Park. Their 8-year-old daughter had been found dead in her sleeping bag, but what terrified the parents was what they saw before she died. She was talking to her shadow, the mother told me over the phone, having a conversation with it, like it was answering back. She seemed scared, kept saying, "I don't want to go with you." Then she started screaming. And when we unzipped her sleeping bag, she was gone, just a shadow burned into the fabric. I realized the entity was growing stronger. Each death fed it more power, allowed it to manipulate shadows across a wider area. At first, it had been confined to the immediate vicinity of the burial mound. Now it was spreading, infecting every shadow within miles of the original site. I drove back to the reservation to find Joseph Crowfeather, but his daughter told me he'd left for a traditional gathering in the mountains. She gave me directions to the sacred site where the tribal elders were meeting, warning me that outsiders weren't usually welcome during ceremonial events. I found the gathering just after sunset, a circle of older Cherokee men and women seated around a fire in a natural clearing. Joseph saw me approaching and gestured for me to join them. "We felt it wake up," he said without preamble. 3 nights ago, the shadow dreams started again. We've been discussing what to do. Can you stop it? I asked. An elderly woman across the fire spoke up. The Oryx, in binding, took the lives of 7 medicine men. They gave their spirits to power the seal. We don't have that kind of spiritual strength in our generation. But there might be another way, Joseph added. The shadow feeds on darkness, but it can be contained by light. Not just any light. It has to be pure, constant, covering the entire area where it's active. The old stories mention using fire, but fire spreads and dies. We need something stronger. What about artificial light? I asked. Industrial lights? Generators? The elders exchanged glances. They were traditional people, suspicious of modern technology, but desperate times called for desperate measures. It might work, Joseph said finally, but you'd need to combine the lights with the proper ceremonies, the binding words spoken in the old language, and it would have to be done during the time of greatest shadow power. When is that? Tomorrow night. The new moon. When natural shadows are strongest, the entity will try to complete its escape. That's when it's most vulnerable, but also most dangerous. As we talked, I became aware that something was wrong with the shadows around our fire. They should have been dancing, moving with the flames. Instead, they remained perfectly still, as if they were listening to our conversation. One of the elders noticed it too. It knows we're planning something, he whispered. The shadow walker can hear through any darkness now. As if in response, every shadow around the fire suddenly stretched toward me. The elders began chanting in Cherokee, and the shadows retreated, but I could feel malevolent intelligence watching from every patch of darkness beyond our firelight. You're the one who woke it up, Joseph said. It's going to focus its attacks on you now. The closer we get to tomorrow night, the more aggressive it will become. Driving home, my truck's shadow on the road began moving independently, swerving back and forth like it was trying to cause an accident. I had to focus entirely on the physical steering wheel, ignoring what my shadow was doing, to make it safely back to town. At my apartment, I found every light switch in the building had been turned off. The hallways were completely dark, filled with moving shadows that reached toward me as I climbed the stairs. I made it to my door using only my flashlight, but when I got inside, I discovered that my girlfriend Lisa was gone. There was a note on the kitchen table written in her handwriting. Gone to find the real Diana. This shadow isn't fooling anyone. I realized with growing horror that the entity had created shadow duplicates of people it had killed, and now it was using them to isolate me, turning the people I cared about against shadow versions of myself. I was alone, surrounded by an intelligent darkness that was growing stronger every hour, with less than 24 hours to stop it before it achieved complete freedom. And somewhere in the darkness, I could hear it laughing with my own voice. I spent the final day gathering equipment from every source I could find: industrial floodlights from the Forest Service Maintenance Depot, portable generators from the local construction company, extra fuel, extension cords, anything that could produce bright, sustained light. Joseph Crow Feather met me at the Caldwell site just before sunset, carrying a leather bag filled with traditional ceremonial items: sage, cedar, carved stones marked with Cherokee symbols. He'd brought 3 other tribal elders, all volunteers who understood they might not survive the night. The binding ceremony must be performed at the exact center of the entity's power, Joseph explained as we set up the lights around the burial mound. You'll need to stand directly over the disturbed grave while we speak the containment words. The sun was setting, and already I could see the shadows around the clearing beginning to move independently. My own shadow kept trying to walk toward the burial mound, dragging slightly behind my actual movements, as if it was being pulled by invisible strings. We positioned the floodlights in a perfect circle around the archaeological site, each one powered by its own generator to ensure redundancy. When I threw the switch, the entire area blazed with artificial daylight, bright enough to eliminate every shadow within a 100-foot radius. The effect was immediate. From the darkness beyond our light circle came a sound like screaming wind filled with rage and pain. The entity was hurt by the sudden illumination, but far from defeated. "Now!" Joseph shouted, and the 4 elders began chanting in Cherokee, their voices rising in ancient words that seemed to resonate through the ground itself. I walked to the center of the light circle, directly over the excavation site. The moment my feet touched the disturbed earth, I felt the entity's full attention focus on me like a crushing weight. The temperature plummeted, frost forming on the grass despite the heat from the floodlights. The chanting grew louder, and I could feel power building in the air around us. But the entity was fighting back. Beyond the circle of light, shadows were massing, growing thicker and more substantial, preparing for an assault. Then the first generator failed. One corner of our light circle went dark, and immediately shadow figures poured into the gap. They looked like people I recognized. Martin Welsh, Mary Caldwell, the dead campers, but their eyes were empty black holes, and they moved with predatory grace that was entirely inhuman. "Keep chanting," I yelled to the elders as I ran to restart the failed generator. But when I pulled the starter cord, my own shadow grabbed the rope from the other side, preventing the engine from turning over. I was fighting my own shadow for control of the generator, while shadow duplicates of dead people advanced on the Cherokee elders. Joseph's voice never wavered, continuing the binding ceremony even as a shadow version of Dr. Welsh reached for his throat. That's when I remembered something from my anthropological research. Cherokee binding ceremonies required a willing sacrifice. Someone had to give their life force to power the spiritual seal. I understood what I had to do. I stopped fighting my shadow and instead grabbed it with both hands. The moment I made physical contact with my own shadow, I felt the entity's consciousness flood into my mind. It was ancient, hungry, filled with rage at being imprisoned for centuries. But it was also desperate, weakened by its long confinement, and I realized it needed to feed on fear and desperation to maintain its power. Instead of fear, I gave it knowledge. As an anthropologist, I'd spent years studying Cherokee spiritual practices. I knew the binding words, understood the ceremonial requirements, and had enough respect for the culture to perform the ritual correctly. While the entity tried to possess my mind through shadow contact, I began speaking the containment words in Cherokee, adding my voice to the elders' chanting. The effect was dramatic. The entity recoiled from my consciousness, unable to corrupt someone who approached it with academic understanding rather than superstitious terror. The shadow duplicates around the light circle began to dissolve, losing cohesion as the entity's power was redirected toward fighting the binding ceremony. But the ritual required a sacrifice, and I was the only one in direct contact with the entity. I felt my life force being drawn out through my shadow, feeding into the spiritual seal that would re-imprison the Shadow Walker. The world grew dim around me as my strength drained away. Joseph realized what was happening. "Diana, let go. You don't have to die for this." But I did. The entity had grown too strong from its recent feeding. The binding ceremony needed more power than the elders could provide alone. I was the one who'd disturbed its prison, and I had to be the one to repair the seal. As my vision faded, I spoke the final words of the containment ritual. The entity let out a sound like tearing metal as it was pulled back into the earth, its consciousness compressed back into the stone-lined chamber beneath the burial mound. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was my shadow being sucked into the ground, leaving me standing shadowless in the blazing artificial light. I woke up 3 days later in the regional hospital, alive, but fundamentally changed. The doctors said I'd suffered from severe hypothermia and exhaustion, but they couldn't explain why my body temperature had dropped to near freezing levels in the middle of summer. Joseph Crow Feather was sitting beside my hospital bed when I opened my eyes. "The binding worked," he said quietly. "The Shadow Walker is contained again. But the price." I sat up carefully and looked around the room. Everything seemed normal until I noticed what was missing. The morning sun was streaming through the window. Other patients had normal shadows cast by the light, but I cast no shadow at all. "I gave it to the binding ceremony," I said, understanding instinctively what had happened. "My shadow is part of the seal now." Joseph nodded. "It will make you difficult to photograph. People will notice something's wrong with you, even if they can't identify what. But you're alive, and the entity is imprisoned." Over the following weeks, I learned to live without a shadow. It was stranger than I'd expected. People unconsciously noticed the absence, making them uncomfortable around me. Children stared openly, sensing something unnatural. I had to request a transfer to a different forest district somewhere people didn't know me before the incident. The official report blamed the deaths on a gas leak from underground deposits causing hallucinations and asphyxiation. The archaeological site was permanently closed to the public, designated as a geological hazard zone. Joseph worked with tribal authorities to ensure the burial mound would be monitored and protected by Cherokee spiritual leaders. But sometimes, on moonless nights, I drive back to the Caldwell site to check on the seal. The industrial floodlights are still there, powered by solar batteries now, keeping the burial mound illuminated around the clock. The Cherokee elders visit monthly to renew the spiritual protections. And sometimes, when I stand at the edge of the light circle, I can see my shadow down there in the earth, still bound to the darkness, still holding the shadow walker in its underground prison. It waves at me occasionally, a greeting from the part of myself that I sacrificed to keep the world safe. The entity is contained but not destroyed. It's patient, cunning, waiting for another opportunity to escape. As long as I live, as long as my shadow remains part of the binding ceremony, the seal will hold. But I won't live forever, and when I die, someone else will need to take responsibility for keeping the shadow walker buried. That's why I'm writing this down. The official records are lies, designed to keep people away from a danger they can't understand. But someone needs to know the truth. Someone needs to be ready, in case the shadows start moving again. Because in the Chattahoochee National Forest, in the deepest part of the woods where the Cherokee once bound an ancient evil, something waits in the darkness beneath the pines. And it remembers the taste of human shadows. It's always hungry, and it's always watching. My name is Elena Darkwater, and I wish I could tell you this story isn't real. But every word happened exactly as I'm going to tell you. I was 24 years old in 1989, fresh out of college with a forestry degree and my first job as a ranger in Pisgah National Forest, North Carolina. I thought I knew everything about trees and plants. I was wrong about everything that mattered. The ranger station sat at the base of Looking Glass Rock, surrounded by old oak trees that had been growing there for hundreds of years. My grandmother always said those trees remembered things. She was half Cherokee and full of old stories I never believed. Now I wish I had listened better. I'd been working there for 2 years when the first strange thing happened. It was October, and the leaves were turning brilliant red and gold. I was checking on a sick oak tree about 3 miles from the main trail. This tree was huge, probably 400 years old, with a trunk so wide it would take 6 people holding hands to wrap around it. The tree looked wrong, not sick wrong, but wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. The bark had patterns that looked almost like faces if you squinted at them. The branches hung lower than they should, like they were reaching for something. And it was quiet around that tree. No birds, no insects, nothing. I took photos and measurements like I always did. Professional work. I had my clipboard, my measuring tape, my soil samples, everything normal. But when I touched the bark to scrape off a sample, it felt warm. Trees don't feel warm in October. That night I called my supervisor, Jim Morrison. He'd been a ranger for 20 years and knew these woods better than anyone. "Jim, there's something weird about that old oak near Marker 47, I told him. The bark feels warm and there's no wildlife around it at all. "Elena, you're new to these mountains," he said. But his voice sounded strange. "Some trees get sick in ways we don't understand. Just keep an eye on it and file your report." "Have other people mentioned this tree before?" There was a long pause. "A few hikers have complained about strange sounds coming from that area, probably just wind through the branches. You know how sounds carry in the forest." But I knew what wind through branches sounded like. This was something else. The next morning I went back to the tree. In daylight, it looked even worse. The face-like patterns in the bark were clearer now, and they all looked like they were screaming. The branches moved in a way that didn't match the wind at all. I was taking more photos when I heard it. A sound like crying coming from inside the tree. I pressed my ear against the warm bark and listened. The crying was definitely coming from inside the trunk. It sounded like a woman, sobbing and calling for help. "Hello?" I called out, feeling stupid. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped. Then very faintly I heard a voice. "Help us. We're trapped. Please help us." I jumped back from the tree so fast I dropped my camera. The voice was coming from inside the wood itself. I ran back to the station and called Jim again. "I heard voices coming from inside the oak tree," I told him. "Someone might be trapped in there somehow." "Elena, that's impossible. Trees don't have hollow spaces big enough for people." "I know it sounds crazy, but I heard it. A woman's voice asking for help." Jim sighed. "Look, rookie, these old forests play tricks on your mind. Sound echoes weird. Shadows look like things they're not. You'll get used to it." But I couldn't let it go. That night I drove to the Cherokee Reservation where my grandmother lived. She was 87 years old and still sharp as a tack. I told her everything. She didn't look surprised at all. "That tree has been trouble for longer than anyone remembers," she said, pouring me coffee in her small kitchen. "My grandmother told me stories about it when I was little. The Cherokee used to avoid that whole area." "What kind of stories?" "About a spirit that lived in trees. It would steal people and keep them alive inside the wood, feeding on their life force. The old shamans bound it long ago, but bindings don't last forever." I wanted to laugh, but her face was too serious. "Grandma, you know I believe in science, not spirits. Science doesn't explain everything, Elena, especially not in those mountains. Your Cherokee blood should tell you that." She was right about one thing. I did feel different in these woods than I had in any other forest. More connected somehow, like the trees were watching me. "What am I supposed to do if the stories are true?" "Learn the old ways," she said, "and be very, very careful." I should have listened to my grandmother's warning. Instead, I went back to the tree the next morning with a digital recorder and my best scientific skepticism. The crying started as soon as I got within 50 feet of the oak. This time, it wasn't just one voice. It was dozens of voices, all coming from inside the tree. Men, women, children, all crying, all begging for help. I turned on my recorder and got it all. "Please help us," a man's voice said clearly. "We can't move. We can't get out." "How long have we been here?" a woman asked. "I can't remember." "I want to go home," a child whispered. "I want my mom." My hands were shaking as I held the recorder. This was impossible. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was some kind of echo effect, or sounds from the trail carrying in the wind. But the voices knew I was there. "Can you hear us?" the man's voice asked. "Please, we see you out there. Help us." I pressed my hand against the bark. It was definitely warm, and I could feel a faint vibration, like a heartbeat. "Who are you?" I asked out loud, feeling like an idiot. "My name is David Chen," the man's voice said. "I was hiking with my family in 1987. We camped near here. Something grabbed us in the night." 1987, 2 years ago. I ran back to the ranger station and pulled up missing person reports on Jim's computer. There it was. David Chen, age 35, missing with his wife Sarah and daughter Amy. Last seen camping near Looking Glass Rock. No trace ever found. My blood went cold. There were dozens of missing person reports from this area going back decades. Hikers, campers, even some locals. All vanished without a trace. I called Jim and told him what I'd found. "Elena, I need you to stay away from that tree," he said. His voice was sharp now, worried. "File your report and move on to other areas." "Jim, people are missing. What if they're somehow trapped?" "What if they're what? Trapped inside a tree? Do you hear how that sounds?" He was right. It sounded insane. But I had recordings. I had evidence. That afternoon, I brought a camping group past the tree to see if they could hear the voices too. There were 5 of them, a family from Virginia on their first trip to the mountains. We were about 100 yards from the oak when the father, Tom Bradley, stopped walking. "Do you hear that?" he asked his wife. "Hear what?" "Crying. Someone's crying in the woods." I felt my heart start pounding. "What does it sound like to you?" "Like someone's in trouble. We should check it out." I should have turned them around right then. Instead, I let them get closer to the tree. The voices started up louder than I'd ever heard them. The whole family could hear them now. The 2 kids, maybe 8 and 10 years old, started crying. "Mommy, the people in the tree are scared," the little girl said. That's when I saw the first face in the bark. It was clear as day, a woman's face, twisted in agony, right in the trunk of the tree. Her mouth was open like she was screaming, but no sound came out. As we watched, another face appeared, next to hers. Then another. The Bradley family started backing away, but something was wrong with their movements. They were moving slowly, like they were walking through thick mud. "I can't move my feet," Tom said. His voice was calm, but his eyes were terrified. I looked down. Thin roots had grown up through the forest floor around their feet. Not just around, through. The roots were growing into their shoes, wrapping around their ankles. "Don't move," I told them. "Stay perfectly still." But it was too late. The roots were climbing up their legs now, visible under their pants. The family was sinking slowly into the ground. "Help us," Sarah Bradley said. She wasn't panicking, which was the worst part. Her voice was dreamy, distant. "We can't feel our legs." I grabbed my axe and started chopping at the roots around Tom's feet. Every time I cut one, 2 more grew back. The tree was pulling them down inch by inch. That's when I heard my grandmother's voice in my head, speaking Cherokee words I somehow understood. "Nvi Iv, Nvi Iv." Tree spirit, tree spirit. Without thinking, I pressed my hands against the oak's trunk and spoke to it in Cherokee. "Let them go. Take me instead." The roots stopped growing immediately. The voices in the tree went silent. "Run," I told the Bradley family. "Run now, and don't look back." They could move again. They stumbled away from the tree, holding each other, moving as fast as they could back toward the main trail. I stood alone with the screaming tree. The bark under my hands was burning hot now. The faces in the wood were moving, trying to speak, and I could feel something vast and hungry turning its attention to me. "You have Cherokee blood," a voice said. Not from the tree this time, but inside my head. "You can hear us properly." "What are you?" I asked. "We are what remains. The tree took us, but we are still ourselves, still aware. It feeds on us slowly, keeping us alive so we last longer." "How many of you are there?" 47 souls. Some of us have been here since the 1940s. Time moves differently inside the wood. I looked up at the massive trunk, really seeing it for the first time. If it had been growing for hundreds of years, feeding on human life force, no wonder it was so huge. "Can I free you?" "Only a Cherokee who knows the old ways can unbind the tree spirit. But the cost is high." "What cost?" The voice in my head grew sad. "Someone must take the guardian's place. Someone must stay with the tree to keep it bound." I understood. To free 47 trapped souls, someone else had to take their place. That night I called my grandmother. My grandmother came to the forest the next morning with a bag full of things that looked like they belonged in a museum. Sage bundles, carved bone tools, small clay pots filled with powders I couldn't identify. "Show me the tree," she said. We walked through the woods in the early morning mist. I could hear the voices before we got close. They were louder now, more desperate. The tree itself looked bigger somehow, its branches reaching further, its roots pushing up through the ground in thick ridges. "It's getting stronger," my grandmother said. "Feeding off the family you saved yesterday made it hungry for more. I thought I stopped it from taking them." "You did, but it tasted their life force before you made it. Let go. Now it wants to feed properly." As we got closer to the oak, I could see that the forest around it was changing. Other trees were leaning toward it like they were listening. The smaller plants were growing in unnatural patterns, forming spirals and shapes that hurt to look at. The tree spirit is spreading its influence, my grandmother said. Soon it will control all the plants in this area. Then it will be strong enough to break free completely. We were 50 feet from the oak when it happened. The ground erupted. Thick roots burst up all around us, whipping through the air like tentacles. I grabbed my granddaughters, mother and dove, to the side as a root the size of a telephone pole smashed down where we'd been standing. More roots were coming up everywhere, and they were all moving with purpose. They weren't just growing, they were hunting. "The tree knows you're Cherokee," my grandmother shouted over the sound of splitting earth. "It's afraid of you." A root wrapped around my ankle and started dragging me toward the oak. I could see the faces in the bark clearly now. Dozens of them, all screaming silently. And I could feel the tree's hunger like a physical thing, pulling at my life force, even from a distance. My grandmother started chanting in Cherokee, old words that seemed to make the air itself vibrate. The root around my ankle loosened slightly but didn't let go. That's when I saw the other campers. 3 college kids had been hiking the early morning trail. They'd been caught in the root attack and were being dragged toward the tree just like I was. But they were closer to it than I was. I watched in horror as the roots pulled them right up against the trunk. The bark began to soften and open like a mouth. The tree was going to swallow them alive. "No!" I screamed, and somehow broke free from the root holding me. I ran toward the 3 kids, dodging whipping branches and emerging roots. My grandmother's chanting got louder, and I felt power flowing through me. Not my power, but something older. Something that came from the Cherokee side of my blood. I reached the first kid, a boy about 20 years old, just as the tree began pulling him into the softened bark. I grabbed his arms and pulled back. The tree was stronger, but I was desperate. "Help us," the voices inside the tree called out. "Use our strength too." Suddenly I could feel all 47 trapped souls lending me their power. Together, we were stronger than the tree spirit. I pulled the boy free and grabbed the other 2 kids. "Run," I told them. "Get out of the forest and don't come back." They ran, but the tree wasn't giving up. The whole forest was moving now. Branches from every direction were reaching for us. Vines shot up from the ground like striking snakes. Even the grass was growing tall enough to tangle our feet. My grandmother was still chanting, but I could see she was getting tired. The tree spirit was too strong for her alone. "What do I have to do?" I asked the voices in my head. "Learn the binding ceremony," they said. "But first, you must survive what comes next." The tree was getting more desperate and more violent. As we backed away from it, I could see its roots spreading under the ground in all directions. Every plant they touched began to change, growing bigger and more aggressive. We made it back to the ranger station, but even there we weren't safe. The trees around the building were starting to lean in toward it. Vines were creeping up the walls. The carefully maintained lawn was growing into thick, grasping weeds. I called Jim and told him we needed to evacuate the entire area. "Elena, you're talking about closing down half the park. I need more than stories about evil trees." "Then come see for yourself. Bring a camera." An hour later, Jim arrived with 2 other rangers and a local sheriff's deputy. They took one look at the forest around the station, where every plant was now visibly moving and growing toward the building, and started making phone calls. By afternoon, we had the area cordoned off as a geological hazard. The official story was that underground gas pockets were causing unstable ground conditions. The real story was that we had a tree spirit trying to take over an entire forest. That evening, my grandmother taught me the first part of the binding ceremony. "You'll need 4 sacred elements," she said. "Water from a Cherokee holy spring, sage burned in the old way, blood from someone with Cherokee heritage, and the heartwood from a tree that died naturally." "Where am I going to find all that?" "I brought the verse 3. The heartwood you'll have to cut from the oak itself." I stared at her. "You want me to cut into that tree while it's actively trying to kill me?" "It's the only way to bind it." properly. But Elena, she took my hands in hers. Once you start the ceremony, you can't stop. If you fail, the tree spirit will be free to spread as far as it wants. It could take over forests for hundreds of miles. And if I succeed, someone has to stay to maintain the binding. The guardian becomes part of the forest, but keeps their human consciousness to watch over it. I thought about the 47 people trapped inside the oak. I thought about the Bradley family, who would have joined them if I hadn't been there. I thought about all the campers and hikers who came through these woods every year, never knowing how close they came to disappearing forever. "I'll do it," I said. We started the ceremony at midnight when the tree spirit's power was strongest. My grandmother had spent the day teaching me Cherokee words I'd never heard before, showing me hand movements that felt both foreign and familiar, like something from a half-remembered dream. The forest was completely hostile now. Every step toward the oak was a battle against roots that tried to trip us, branches that swung at our heads, and vines that shot out to wrap around our throats. The air itself felt thick and wrong, like breathing soup. The voices from inside the tree were screaming now, not crying for help anymore, but screaming in pure terror and pain. The tree spirit was feeding on them more aggressively, trying to gain enough power to break free completely. "It knows what we're doing," my grandmother said. "It's desperate." When we got within 30 feet of the oak, I could see why she was worried. The tree had grown even bigger since morning. Its trunk was now so wide I couldn't see all the way around it, and its branches stretched up into the darkness like arms reaching for the moon. The faces in the bark were moving constantly now, mouths opening and closing, eyes darting back and forth. And there were more faces than before. The tree had been hunting during the day. "How many people are in there now?" I asked. "Too many," my grandmother replied grimly. I started the ceremony by sprinkling blessed water around the base of the tree. Every drop that hit the roots caused them to recoil like I'd thrown acid on them. The tree spirit's rage hit me like a physical force, nearly knocking me over. Next came the sage. As the smoke rose around the oak, the faces in the bark became clearer. I could see their expressions of hope mixing with their terror. They knew we were trying to free them, but they also knew what would happen if we failed. Then I had to cut the heartwood. My grandmother had given me an old Cherokee knife carved from bone and obsidian. It looked like something that belonged in a museum, but it cut through the oak's bark like butter. The tree screamed. Not with human voices this time, but with the voice of the tree spirit itself, a sound like breaking wood and rushing wind and animal rage all mixed together. The sound was so loud it knocked birds out of the sky. As I cut deeper into the heartwood, black sap began pouring out like blood. The sap was warm and thick, and it moved on its own, trying to flow upward instead of down. "That's its life force," my grandmother said. "Cut deeper." I pushed the knife in further, and suddenly the tree went completely silent. Even the voices inside stopped. Then I felt it, the tree spirit's consciousness touching mine. It was old. Older than the Cherokee, older than humans on this continent at all. It had been sleeping in this forest for thousands of years before people arrived, feeding slowly on animal life. When the first humans came, it discovered their life force was much richer, much more satisfying. It didn't understand why what it did was wrong. To the tree spirit, humans were just another kind of anims. It kept them alive inside its wood the same way a spider keeps flies alive in its web, fresh food that lasts longer. But it also showed me what would happen if I completed the binding ceremony. I would become the new guardian, yes, but I wouldn't lose my humanity the way I'd thought. Instead, I'd become something in between, part human, part forest spirit, conscious and aware but connected to every plant in the area. I'd be able to feel the health of the entire ecosystem, to guide its growth and protect it from harm. I'd also be able to communicate with the trapped souls to ease their fear and pain while I worked to free them one by one. It would take years, maybe decades, but I could eventually release all of them. The tree spirit wasn't evil, I realized. It was just very, very old and had never learned a different way to exist. If I became the guardian, I could teach it better ways to feed, ways that didn't require trapping human souls. I looked at my grandmother, and she nodded like she'd seen the same vision. "It's your choice, Elena, but choose quickly." The tree was starting to move again, its roots bursting up all around us. Other trees were leaning in closer, their branches reaching down like fingers. The entire forest was preparing to attack at once. I took a deep breath and cut all the way through to the tree's heart. The world exploded with green light. Power flowed through the Cherokee knife into my hands, up my arms, through my whole body. I felt myself expanding, my consciousness spreading out through root systems and mycorrhizal networks until I was connected to every living plant for miles around. The tree spirit's rage turned to confusion, then to something like curiosity. It had never encountered a human who could match its power before. I spoke to it directly, mind to mind, showing it better ways to live. I showed it how it could feed on sunlight and soil nutrients like other trees, how it could form partnerships with animals instead of trapping them, how it could be part of the forest ecosystem instead of dominating it. The Tree-Spirit listened, and slowly, very slowly, it began to change. The binding ceremony worked, but not the way my grandmother expected. Instead of trapping the tree spirit, I merged with it. Instead of becoming its prisoner, I became its teacher. And instead of losing my humanity, I gained something much larger. I can still walk around in human form when I need to, but most of the time I exist as part of the forest itself. I feel the growth of every seedling, the health of every stream, the migration patterns of every animal. The Cherokee called it becoming a forest guardian, but it's more like becoming the forest's nervous system. The 47 trapped souls were freed over the course of 3 years. I had to teach each one how to let go of their connection to the tree and move on to whatever comes after death. Some were afraid to leave. They'd been trapped for so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to be truly alive. But eventually, all of them chose to go. The last one was David Chen, the hiker whose voice I'd heard first. Before he left, he thanked me. "You gave us peace," he said, "and you gave us hope that someone would remember us." I do remember them. All 47 names are carved into my memory along with their stories, their families, their dreams. They're part of the forest's history now, and part of mine. The oak tree still stands, but it's different now. It's still enormous, but it feels peaceful instead of hungry. Campers sometimes rest in its shade without ever knowing what it used to be. Children climb on its lower branches while their parents take pictures. The faces in the bark are gone. Instead, the tree's trunk shows the natural patterns of healthy growth, rings that mark each year of abundant rain and drought, scars from old lightning strikes that healed clean, holes where woodpeckers raised their young. Sometimes hikers tell stories about out hearing voices in these woods, but they're different voices now. Whispers that warn them away from dangerous cliff edges, sounds that guide them back to the trail when they get lost. Words in Cherokee that they don't understand but somehow know mean safe journey. My grandmother lived 5 more years after the ceremony. She spent those years teaching me Cherokee plant medicine, forest ecology, and the proper ways to communicate with the spirits that live in wild places. When she died, I felt her spirit join the forest network for just a moment before moving on to whatever comes next. "You did good, granddaughter," she told me. "The forest is in good hands." Jim Morrison retired 2 years after the incident. He never really understood what happened, but he knew the forest was different afterward, safer. He recommended me for a promotion to head ranger, not knowing I'd already accepted a much bigger responsibility. I've been guardian of these woods for over 30 years now. I've prevented dozens of accidents, guided thousands of lost hikers back to safety, and helped researchers understand the complex relationships between the plants and animals that call this forest home. I've also encountered 3 other tree spirits in different parts of the country. 2 of them were like the oak spirit, old and confused and feeding in ways that hurt people. I was able to teach them better methods. The 3rd one was already peaceful, living in harmony with its forest. It taught me new techniques for healing damaged ecosystems. There are more spirits out there, more forests that need guardians, more places where the old powers are waking up as the modern world encroaches on their territory. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice. I could have lived a normal human life, had children, grown old in the usual way. Instead, I'm something between human and spirit, tied to this forest for as long as it stands. But then I'll feel a family of deer bedding down safely for the night, or sense a rare orchid blooming in a hidden grove, or guide a lost child back to two ear-worried parents. And I know I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The forest remembers everything. Every animal that lived and died here, every tree that grew and fell, every human who passed through with respect or fear or wonder. I'm part of that memory now, a living bridge between the human world and the wild places that still hold secrets older than civilization. And I'm not the only one. If you're ever hiking alone in an old forest and you hear whispers in a language you don't recognize, or feel like you're being guided away from danger, or sense a presence that's neither threatening nor entirely human, you might have encountered one of us. We're the guardians of the wild places. We're the bridge between worlds. We're the reason the old powers sleep peacefully instead of waking up hungry. We remember what was lost, protect what remains, and watch over those who walk gently through our domains. The forests are not empty places. They never were. They're just waiting for humans to remember how to listen. My name is Rebecca Ironwood, and I've been a forest ranger at Daniel Boone National Forest for 6 years now. Before that, I spent 2 years as an Army medic in Vietnam, patching up soldiers in field hospitals while rockets exploded overhead. After seeing enough real monsters in that war, I figured the worst thing I'd face in these Kentucky mountains would be lost hikers and maybe a black bear. I was wrong about that. The Red River Gorge section of Daniel Boone is my territory. 200 square miles of limestone cliffs, deep caves, and thick forests that tourists love to explore. Most days, my biggest problem is convincing city folks that flip-flops aren't proper hiking shoes. I've got my ranger station set up in an old cabin near Chimney Top Rock, equipped with radio gear, medical supplies, and enough coffee to keep me going through the long shifts. People ask why a woman from Louisville would want to live alone in the mountains. Truth is, after what I saw in Vietnam, soldiers torn apart by shrapnel, kids no older than my little brother bleeding out in my hands, I needed the quiet. The forest doesn't lie to you. Trees don't scream. Animals kill clean and quick for food or territory, not because some politician decided they should. That Tuesday morning in July started like any other. I was restocking my first aid kit when the radio crackled to life. Ranger Station, this is Cave Rescue Team Alpha. We have a situation at Devil's Canyon Cave. Multiple casualties. Request immediate medical assistance. I grabbed my gear and drove the 20 minutes to Devil's Canyon, a cave system popular with experienced spelunkers. The rescue team's trucks were parked at the entrance, but something felt wrong. The silence was too complete. No voices calling updates, no equipment running. "Hello, Cave Rescue?" I called out as I approached the cave mouth. That's when I smelled it. Sweet and rotten, like meat left in the sun. In Vietnam, we called it the smell of death. But this was different, stronger, hungrier, if that makes sense. I found the first body 20 feet inside the cave. Tom Morrison, the rescue team leader, was sprawled against the limestone wall. His uniform was shredded and his chest cavity was empty. Not cut open by a blade, but torn apart by something with claws and teeth. Bite marks covered his arms and legs, and the strange thing was the wounds looked fresh, like he'd been eaten while still alive and fighting. My medic training kicked in. Check for survivors first, investigate later. But as I moved deeper into the cave system, following the rescue team's rope line, I found piece after piece of the 6-man team. Jerry Walsh was missing everything below the waist. Mike Chen looked like something had tried to swallow him feet first and given up halfway. In the deepest chamber, I found a waterproof journal still clutched in Dave Santos's dead hand. His final entry was dated that morning. Something down here with us. Not an animal. It got Jenkins first. We could hear him screaming while it was eating him. Still alive. Still screaming. The sound it makes when it chews. God help us. It's coming back. I've seen battlefield medicine. I know what bullets and shrapnel do to human bodies, but this was different. The bite marks were too big, too deep. The tears in the flesh suggested something with claws longer than any bear, and the way the bones were cracked and sucked clean. Whatever did this had been feeding methodically, keeping its victims alive as long as possible. Standing in that cave, holding Dave's journal, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Vietnam, the absolute certainty that I was being watched by something that wanted to kill me. The hair on my neck stood up, and every instinct I'd developed in 2 years of war was screaming at me to run. I backed out of that cave system as fast as I could move without turning my back on the darkness. Even in broad daylight, loading the first bodies into my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still down there, waiting. The next morning, I radioed the county sheriff to report the cave incident. Sheriff Tom Bradley had worked these mountains for 15 years and seen everything from meth lab explosions to tourist deaths. But when he arrived at the cave with his deputy, even he went quiet. "Rebecca, I've never seen anything like this," he said, examining Tom Morrison's remains. "What kind of animal could do this?" "No animal I know," I told him. "The bite radius is too large for a bear, and the feeding pattern is wrong. Bears don't eat people alive." We spent 3 hours documenting the scene and recovering bodies. The whole time I kept checking the cave mouth, expecting to see movement in the darkness. The feeling of being watched never left me. That evening I was updating my incident report when the radio call came in. "Ranger Station, this is the campground host at Pine Ridge. We've got a problem at campsite 47, family of 6. They're missing." Pine Ridge was only 8 miles from Devil's Canyon Cave. I drove there with a growing sense of dread that proved justified. The Henderson family from Indiana had set up camp 2 days ago. Parents, 2 teenage sons, twin daughters about 10 years old. Their campsite looked like a tornado had hit it. The tent was shredded, camping chairs scattered in the trees, cooler contents spread across 50 yards of forest floor. But there was no blood. "Tracks head northeast," Deputy Marshal said, pointing to disturbed undergrowth. "Whatever took them was big and moving fast." We followed the trail for 2 miles before we found the first body. Mrs. Henderson was hanging upside down from an oak tree 15 feet off the ground. Her clothing was torn away, and her torso showed the same methodical bite marks I'd seen in the cave. But she wasn't dead when we found her. "Help," she whispered through torn lips. "Still hungry." She died while I was cutting her down. Mr. Henderson was nearby, propped against a tree trunk, missing both legs from the knees down. Fresh blood still dripped from the wounds. He'd been alive until very recently. "Where are your children?" I asked, checking his pulse. His eyes rolled back, showing only whites. "The hunger," he mumbled. "So hungry. Wanted to eat Sarah's fingers. They looked so—" He was gone before he could finish. We found the 2 boys that night, but they weren't in any condition to tell us what happened. Both were catatonic, staring at nothing, covered in bite marks that were still bleeding. The strange thing was, they had human bite marks on their arms and shoulders, small ones like a child's teeth. The 10-year-old girls were nowhere to be found. "We need to call in the state police," Sheriff Bradley said as we loaded the boys into the ambulance. "Maybe the FBI. This isn't normal." I agreed, but part of me already knew this wasn't something law enforcement could handle. The cave rescue team had been experienced outdoorsmen with radios and equipment. The Henderson family had been camping in a designated area, following all safety protocols. Whatever was hunting in these mountains wasn't limited by normal predator behavior. That night I stayed awake in my ranger station, radio on, checking and rechecking my doors and windows. Around 2 a.m., I heard something moving outside. Not the normal sounds of deer or raccoons, but something large walking on 2 legs. The footsteps circled my cabin 3 times, then stopped at the front door. I could hear breathing on the other side of the wood, deep, raspy breaths that lasted too long and came too slow for any human. The smell of death and rot seeped under the door. Then I heard a voice, a little girl's voice, sweet and innocent. "Aunt, Miss Ranger Lady? We're hungry. Can you help us? We're so hungry." I knew that voice belonged to one of the Henderson twins, but something was wrong with it. Too eager, too desperate. And underneath the child's words, I could hear something else breathing, something much larger. "Sarah?" I called softly through the door. "Sarah Henderson, is that you?" "We found something in the forest, Miss Ranger Lady. It showed us how to stop being hungry, but now we can't stop. We're still so hungry. Won't you come out and help us?" I looked out the window and saw two small shapes standing in my yard. The Henderson girls, still in their torn pajamas, standing perfectly still in the moonlight. But their mouths were wrong, too wide, too full of teeth, and behind them, barely visible in the tree line, something much larger watched and waited. "We're going now, Miss Ranger Lady, but we'll be back. The hunger is spreading, and soon everyone will understand. Soon everyone will be as hungry as we are." The voices faded into the forest, but I didn't sleep for the rest of that night, because I was starting to feel it too. A gnawing emptiness in my stomach that had nothing to do with food, and a growing curiosity about what human flesh might taste like. Over the next week, the missing persons reports came in steady streams. A hunting party of 4 men from Tennessee vanished near Clay Creek. 2 college students on a geology field trip last seen hiking toward Natural Bridge, an elderly couple from their RV at the Coomer Ridge campground. But it wasn't just disappearances anymore. It was what the survivors were doing to each other. The first incident happened at the Mountain View Lodge, a hunting retreat about 15 miles from Devil's Canyon. 14 guests had checked in for a week-long hunting trip. By the 3rd day, only 2 were still alive, and they were found in the lodge's kitchen, cooking and eating the remains of the other 12. "They were still conscious when we got there," Sheriff Bradley told me over the radio. "Talking normally, explaining how they'd figured out that human meat tastes better than venison if you cook it right. Didn't seem to understand why we were upset." I drove to the lodge to help with the investigation. The scene was worse than anything I'd seen in Vietnam. Bodies had been methodically butchered like livestock, meat hung from hooks in the walk-in cooler, bones stacked neatly by the back door. But the 2 survivors, businessmen from Ohio, seemed genuinely confused about why we were arresting them. "We were just so hungry," one of them explained. "George suggested we try a little piece of Harris after he died in the hunting accident, just to see. And it was better than anything I'd ever tasted. We couldn't stop ourselves after that." "What hunting accident?" I asked. They looked at each other, confused. I'm not sure. Harris was just dead when we woke up. Throat torn out. Must have been an animal attack." There had been no animal attack. Harris's body showed the same methodical feeding pattern I'd seen on all the other victims. But somehow, these men believed they'd found him dead and decided to eat him. Their memories had been altered or confused. The second incident was worse. A SWAT team from the county sheriff's department had been called in to search the forest near Pine Ridge. 6 officers, fully equipped with radios and backup protocols. We found them 3 days later in a clearing, arranged in a perfect circle, each man frozen solid despite the 90-degree temperature. But they weren't just frozen. They'd been partially eaten while still alive, and the bite marks on their bodies were still fresh, as if something had been feeding on them continuously for all 3 days. Ice crystals covered their wounds, and their breath was still visible in the summer heat. "What could freeze 6 armed men in July?" Deputy Marshal asked, staring at the scene. I knelt beside Sergeant Hayes, the team leader. His eyes were open and aware following my movement, but his body was rigid with cold. Frost covered his uniform, and when I touched his skin, it was like touching ice. "Sergeant, can you hear me?" His lips barely moved, but I could make out words. Still, hungry, so cold, can't stop eating. All 6 officers were still alive somehow, frozen, partially consumed, but still conscious, still hungry. That night I made the mistake of researching similar incidents. What I found in the old records made my blood run cold. Every 30 to 40 years, going back to 1889, the same pattern emerged in Daniel Boone National Forest. Mass disappearances, cannibalistic incidents, reports of something large moving through the forest. The reports always mentioned the same details. Victims found partially eaten but still alive, survivors with no memory of how the feeding started, and an overwhelming hunger that seemed to spread from person to person. The last major incident was in 1943 during World War II. An entire company of soldiers on training exercises had been found in various states of consumption throughout a 20-square-mile area. The military had classified the incident and blamed it on environmental factors and equipment failure. But buried in one classified report, I found a description that matched exactly what I'd been seeing. Victims displayed unnatural hunger behaviors and continued feeding on human flesh even when restrained. Post-mortem examination revealed victims had been alive and conscious throughout consumption process. Bite marks consistent with unknown large predator, possibly prehistoric in origin. The report was signed by Captain James Ironwood, my grandfather. That's when I realized this thing had been hunting my family for generations. The next morning, I found the Henderson girls' bodies hanging from my radio tower, 50 feet in the air. They'd been dead for days, but their voices were still coming from my radio, calling to other children in the area. "Come play with us. We found something wonderful. Something that makes the hunger go away forever." I shot the radio to pieces, but by then it was too late. Children from 3 different campgrounds had already started walking toward my station, their eyes blank, their mouths too wide, following the voices of the dead girls. And behind them all, getting closer every day, I could feel it watching me. The thing that had killed my grandfather's soldiers, that had been feeding in these mountains for over a century, that had somehow marked my family as special prey. The hunger was spreading faster now, and I was running out of time to stop it. But first, I had to figure out what it was, and why it had chosen me. The answer came from the most unlikely source. Mrs. Whitetail, an 89-year-old Cherokee woman who ran the trading post near Natural Bridge. When I showed up at her store, desperate for any information about the attacks, she took one look at me and nodded like she'd been expecting me. "You're James Ironwood's granddaughter," she said. "You have his eyes, and his curse." She led me to the back room of her store where old hunting rifles hung next to dream catchers and medicine bundles. On the wall was a photograph from 1943, soldiers in training uniforms, including a young man who looked exactly like my father. "Your grandfather came to me before the military sent him into those mountains," Mrs. Whitetail said. "He knew what was hunting out there. The Cherokee have stories about it going back 400 years. We called it Wendigo, the hunger that walks." She pulled out a leather-bound journal filled with drawings and Cherokee writing. The sketches showed a creature 15 feet tall, impossibly thin, with yellowed fangs and ice-blue eyes. In every drawing, it was feeding on living humans. The Wendigo sleeps for decades, then wakes when the hunger becomes too strong. It spreads its curse to everything around, and making people eat each other until the whole forest runs red. But it always chooses one family to hunt personally, yours. According to Mrs. Whitetail's ancestors, the creature had supernatural abilities beyond just size and strength. Its breath could freeze victims solid while keeping them alive and conscious. It could project its voice through the dead, making them call to the living. And worst of all, it could make humans crave human flesh through some kind of scent or chemical it produced. "But it can be killed?" I asked. "Burned completely, every piece. But it regenerates from any part left behind, and it's smart enough to spread pieces of itself around when it senses danger." She closed the journal and looked at me seriously. "Your grandfather tried to kill it with explosives, thought he succeeded, but he only scattered it, made it take longer to reform." "How long?" 35 years. It's been gathering itself back together all this time, and now it's whole again, and very, very hungry." That evening, the attacks reached their climax. The annual Red River Gorge Music Festival was scheduled for the weekend, with over 400 people camping in the forest. I tried to get it canceled, but nobody believed my reports about a supernatural creature. The festival went ahead as planned. I was monitoring the radio from my station when the screaming started. Ranger Station, this is Festival Security. We have multiple casualties at the main stage. People are... Jesus Christ, they're eating each other. Send every ambulance you've got. I drove to the festival grounds as fast as my truck could handle the mountain roads. What I found there will haunt me until the day I die. 400 people had turned into a feeding frenzy. Parents were consuming their own children while the kids screamed and fought. Teenagers were tearing chunks of flesh from their friends' arms and legs, chewing and swallowing while their victims begged them to stop. And through it all, people were still conscious, still aware of what they were doing, but unable to control themselves. At the center of the chaos stood the Wendigo, 15 feet tall and impossibly thin, like a human stretched on a torture rack. Its skin was gray-white and hung loose over prominent bones. Its arms reached almost to the ground, ending in claws longer than my fingers. But the worst part was its face, human features warped by starvation, with eyes like blue ice and a mouth that could unhinge like a snake's jaw. It moved through the crowd systematically, selecting victims and feeding on them while they were still alive. Its breath created clouds of freezing vapor, and everywhere it stepped, frost formed on the ground despite the summer heat. The smell rolling off it was overwhelming. Death and rot, and something else that made my mouth water despite the horror surrounding me. I watched it pick up a screaming child and begin feeding, and something inside me snapped. I'd brought every explosive I could find. Road flares, dynamite left over from trail construction, even some military ordnance I'd kept from Vietnam. The Wendigo noticed me approaching and turned, still holding its partially consumed victim. When our eyes met, I felt its hunger crash into my mind like a physical force. Suddenly, I understood why people were eating each other. The Wendigo wasn't just a predator. It was a living hunger that infected everything around it. It fed on human flesh, but it fed on the act of humans eating humans even more. Each person it drove to cannibalism made it stronger. And it had been hunting my family for generations because we were the only ones who could resist its hunger long enough to fight back. "You killed my grandfather!" I shouted, lighting the first flare. The creature dropped its victim and smiled, showing rows of yellow fangs. When it spoke, its voice was like wind through a graveyard. James Ironwood tasted of courage and desperation. You will taste even better. Meh. It charged me with impossible speed, but I was ready. I dove aside and threw the lit flare directly into its mouth. The creature's scream shattered windows in the nearby buildings, and freezing vapor poured from its throat, but it didn't go down. Instead, it started regenerating. The burned tissue in its mouth grew back in seconds, and it turned toward me with those ice-blue eyes full of ancient hunger. I had one chance. The old coal mine shaft, half a mile away, where they'd been storing dynamite for the new visitor center construction. If I could lure it there, I might be able to bring down enough rock to bury it completely. "Come on, you bastard!" I yelled, running toward the mine. "Let's finish what my grandfather started." The Wendigo followed me through the forest, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. I could feel its hunger pressing against my mind, making me stumble as I fought the urge to stop running and let it feed on me. By the time I reached the mine shaft, I was barely staying ahead of it. The dynamite was stored in the main tunnel, about 200 yards down. I'd helped set those charges myself during the construction project, so I knew exactly how much explosive was down there. Enough to bring down half the mountain. I made it to the charges just as the Wendigo entered the mine behind me. In the confined space, it looked even larger, its claws scraping the tunnel walls as it approached. Ice was already forming on the walls from its breath, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. "You cannot escape the hunger, little Ironwood," it said, its voice echoing off the stone walls. "Your grandfather learned this. Your father learned this. Now you will learn." That's when I understood. It hadn't just killed my grandfather. It had been hunting my family for generations, feeding on us one by one, savoring our particular flavor of courage and stubbornness. We weren't just prey to it. We were its favorite meal. "Yeah, well, I learned a few things in Vietnam that my grandfather never knew," I said, setting the timer on the detonator. The Wendigo lunged forward, But I was already moving. I'd set the timer for 30 seconds, enough time to get clear if I ran, but not enough time for the creature to escape, even with its supernatural speed. I made it 20 yards before the explosion. The sound was like the end of the world. The entire mountain shook, and I was thrown forward by the blast wave, landing hard enough to crack ribs. But behind me, I could hear something much more important than my own pain. I could hear the Wendigo screaming as thousands of tons of rock came down on top of it. When the dust settled, the mine entrance was completely sealed. No gap large enough for a mouse, let alone a 15-foot monster. But more importantly, I could feel the change in the air immediately. The unnatural hunger that had been pressing against my mind was gone. The smell of death and rot was fading. At the festival grounds, people were waking up from their cannibalistic trance, horrified by what they'd done, but no longer compelled to continue. The 127 people who died couldn't be brought back, but the 89 who were still missing were found alive in various caves throughout the forest, traumatized, but alive. The official report blamed the incidents on contaminated water supplies causing mass hallucinations and aggressive behavior. The CDC backed up this story, and the affected area was permanently closed to the public due to geological instability from the mine collapse. But I know the truth, and more importantly, I know it's not over. 3 months after the mine collapse, I was transferred to Yellowstone National Park. The Forest Service said it was a promotion, but I think someone higher up wanted me as far away from Kentucky as possible. I didn't argue. I'd seen enough of what lurked in those mountains, but sometimes, late at night in my new ranger station, I get radio calls from the closed Danny, El Boone Forest. Children's voices asking me to come back and play. Voices I recognize from the festival, from families I couldn't save. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I catch a smell that makes my mouth water in ways it shouldn't. A smell of meat and hunger and something ancient that's been feeding in the dark places of the world for longer than humans have had names for their fears. The mine collapse killed the Wendigo, I'm certain of that. But hunger like that doesn't just disappear. It spreads, it finds new places to take root. And somewhere out there, in another forest, on another mountain, something is waking up with an appetite that can never be satisfied. I still check the missing persons reports from Kentucky every week. So far, nothing that matches the old pattern. But the Cherokee have stories about more than just one Wendigo, and Mrs. Whitetail's final words to me keep echoing in my head. You ended this cycle, Rebecca Ironwood. But the hunger is older than these mountains, and it's always looking for new hunting grounds. My name is Rebecca Ironwood, and I survived something that has been feeding on my family for generations. But I learned something important in those dark Kentucky mountains. Some hungers are too ancient and too powerful to ever really die. They just go to sleep and wait for the right time to wake up again. And they're always, always hungry.